Hello everyone, this is Mladen from Complementary Training, and today I'm talking to Mike Zourdos. In this podcast, we're going to discuss his background and his ideas, mostly Daily Undulating Periodization, for which he's the most famous for. As long, we're just going to drift away and chit-chat about training topics. We're going to cover some questions I prepared and some questions from our Facebook wall that some of the readers posted. Anyway, we are expecting around one to 2 hours of chat, and that's pretty much it. Hopefully we're going to cover a lot of ground and plenty of new ideas, cover some of Mike's research and his applied philosophies and training periodization and training planning. Anyway, quick introduction to Mike. Mike is currently assistant professor and director of muscle physiology research laboratory at Florida Atlantic University. He's also co-author of USA Powerlifting Coaching Curriculum, and he competes in Raw Powerlifting USA Powerlifting Federation under 74 kilos and under 83 kilos. Is that correct, Mike?
That is correct, although I thought this was the marathon training podcast, so I guess I'm in the wrong place.
Yeah. Do you mind sharing something about yourself for the listeners?
Sure. Quite a few things I could share, but I guess, most importantly is I am married, and my wife and I are expecting our first child coming this December, so I always try to keep in mind the important things with all the stuff we talk about in terms of lifting weights. But we're more excited for the family aspect and so forth. So a little insight into, I guess, more personal life rather than just training and lifting weights and so forth. So we do that, and I reside in a city called Miramar, Florida, which is in South Florida, south of Fort Lauderdale and Palm Beach, and plan on staying here for quite a while. So other than lifting weights, which we do on occasion, we live a pretty quiet family life down here that we enjoy.
That's awesome. Congratulations.
Thanks, man.
Congratulations on the baby. It's a rough time. I've been there.
You have kids, right? So if you can send over some notes, man, we'd appreciate it.
Yeah, just listen to your wife. That's basically it. And I didn't.
Oh, man. That's I appreciate you making the wrong choice first to not listen, so I can avoid that. So you sacrificed yourself for me.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, you learn on the mistakes. Hopefully, it's not going to repeat for a second one. So I'll try to be a better husband next time.
Sounds good, man.
Okay, so let's chit chat a bit about certain training programs. What are your thoughts on famous programs that are out there on online, like Starting Strength, 531, Sheiko, Westside, Mike Tusher stuff, and if you're familiar with the Dan Baker Wave approach?
I don't know if I'm familiar with the last one, although I'll start off and I'll try to go through one by one briefly. I say as a rule that programs, if you will, online, I'm not necessarily a fan or not a fan, because a lot of them are programs that you can kind of download from the internet and put your numbers in and calculate the percentages and go ahead and do them. And they're not necessarily based on, not all of them, some of them are that we're going to talk about, but they're not all based on, scientific protocols or this or that. They're just kind of guesswork, and they work for certain reasons that I think I can highlight as to why some of them work. So they're not really based on theories, a lot of them. They're more what I would call routines or programs rather than an overarching concept, which is really what periodization is, and integrating models of periodization together. So, but they're going to work. If you take something like Starting Strength, I actually think Starting Strength is fantastic. This is not something that's for experienced elite level lifters, but if somebody's a beginner getting into it, this is exactly what it's designed for. And the beauty of something like Starting Strength is it focuses on the main lifts. You have a squat, you have a press, you have a pull, and you're gradually utilizing progressive overload. And the two most basic concepts in programming are progressive overload and the SAID principle, specific adaptations to imposed demands, or specificity. So progressive overload, just like Milo of Croton and his calf back in the day, right? That guy is a man amongst men. And he would have progressive overload as he lifted the calf, and it grew bigger every day. Well, that's what Starting Strength does. And it's allowing you to utilize progressive overload. It's allowing you to utilize specificity. So it's going to work. It's nothing that's groundbreaking in science. But man, you could do a lot worse than that. If you have those two components, specificity and progressive overload in your program, in a lot of ways, it doesn't matter what type of periodization you're using, you're going to make progress. Can you do better? Of course, and that's why we research this stuff. But you're going to make progress. If you take something like what Mike T does, Mike Teixeira at Reactive Training Systems, again, I think this is fantastic. Mike, I don't think Mike is a program. Mike is more advanced than starting strength. RTS is now a concept, a theory. He uses periodization principles over time, and then he uses auto-regulation within that periodization model to assign training load. And that's another thing that I think we'll get into today that I don't know if people understand, which is that auto-regulation in and of itself is not a method of periodization. What auto-regulation is a way to assign training load and progress training load within a periodized model, whatever that model may be, whether it's linear, whether it's undulating, whether it's a combination, as it probably should be, and so forth. And then, Mladen, what were the other two that you mentioned?
We had Sheiko and West Side.
Okay, so if you take something like Sheiko, a lot of those programs, I don't know if people realize this, but a lot of those programs, they have certain numbers. They were made for individuals. So when they have certain assistance lifts in there, they were made for those individuals because that's what they were looking to progress at that time. So I'm not too familiar with every single Sheiko number and the intricacies of every single program. So it'd be hard for me to go through all of them. But for the most part, Sheiko is looking at a pretty decent amount of volume, but the intensity is not that high. So in a lot of ways, it's not always something that you're going to do, at least some of the numbers, right before you're peaking for a meet. If you're doing 10, 15 sets of squats on a day, or deficit deadlifts or something like that, that's going to cause quite a bit of damage than going into a competition. So it's something that's more of a volume phase, and you probably want to choose the number that you have, or the number of the Sheiko program by your weak points or whatever you might want to work on at that time. But again, those were developed for individual lifters. So context, as we hear about, context is everything, because you have to figure out where that Sheiko program goes into your linear macro cycle. And that's really the thing about undulating periodization as well, as I know we'll get into, is we have to understand that periodization models can and should be integrated. So if you have a 1-year macro cycle, right, and we'll get into this more, but you have an undulating model where you're undulating repetitions within a week, but over time from January to December, right, if you have one peak at the end of the year, your volume will gradually decline and your intensity will gradually increase, and then you will have sections out the year where you have volume blocks and intensity blocks, and I can sketch that out a little better in a moment, for where everything goes within a linear macro cycle. So if you take a Sheiko program, depending on the number you're going to pick and what you have to work on, that also needs to fit appropriately within a yearly macro cycle. Things aren't magic. The last one, West Side, West Side is an interesting concept, and it has elements of kind of undulating periodization, if you will, in it, inherently in it, because you are alternating within a week, max effort days, dynamic effort days, and so forth. So I think, again, I don't think there's magic in here. I think if you're utilizing the variance of exercises, you have to also be careful on when you use that as well. Since specificity really is king, well, as you get closer to a meet, doing something like West Side where you're constantly rotating max effort days into what you're doing could be a little bit problematic if you're not doing the competition lift as you go right up to it. But certainly it has efficacy, and there's a way to get some volume in there on RE days and so forth. And then, of course, that comes down to, are you a rod lifter or a geared lifter? I would certainly argue that it has more efficacy for a geared lifter, even though I would actually argue West Side, in the way they do things up there, probably has the most efficacy for maybe a team sport athlete like a football player or something like this. I think there would be a really strong way to utilize that there, and I know when I worked as a strength coach at the collegiate level, we utilized some of those principles. One other thing I wanted to hit on, I know you didn't mention it, is the Smoloff program that's out there on the internet. And this is something I think that is really awesome in a lot of ways, but people also misuse it. So if we just take the Smoloff-based mesocycle, and I know that this is something that people use quite a bit. So, and people should be familiar with it, excuse me. So let's just say somebody's squatting on the small off base Monday, Wednesday, Friday, Saturday, which is typically how somebody would do it. We have 9 reps on Monday, 7 reps on Wednesday, 5 reps on Friday, and 3 reps on Saturday. Now, people will go through this base and get 20, 30, 40, 50 pound increases, maybe 20 kilo increases in their squat in 3-4 weeks' time. And that's great. But people think this is magic. It's not magic. The reason this typically works for people is because it usually doubles their frequency. If somebody's squatting twice a week and then they go squat 4 times a week, they're going to get huge increases. That's a huge increase in frequency in what they're doing and, excuse me, a huge change in volume in what they're doing. So it's not magic. They've just simply increased the frequency and the volume. So people think, oh man, I've hit on the magic set and rep scheme. Well, that doesn't exist. So, but they get this huge increase and they think there's something that's inherently magical about it. There's not. It's just increased volume and it's increased frequency. Additionally, I'd like to point out that small off has components of undulating periodization, or what I like to call undulating programming, and I think that's an important distinction within the base mesocycle. So if, let's say, you have a frequency of 4 times a week, small off has what I call an undulation pattern, and I think that's a new term I'd kind of like to introduce because it's a very easy way to explain things. If you go Monday, Wednesday, Friday, Saturday, the undulation pattern in terms of reps is 9, 7, 5, and 3. So it actually has undulating programming components within it. So it's very interesting how that sets up. It's not magical, but it does have some of the scientific elements in terms of overload, higher frequency, higher volume, and undulating programming within it. So the problem that people have, though, is they'll start it before they're ready for it. Volume is the key, but you should also make progress on as little volume as you can for as long as you can, which is why people will simply double their volume to utilize this program. They'll get huge increases, but then they have a monster drop-off when they're done with it, or they have some injuries when they're done with it, and it takes them a long time to get back. So it's something that you should only utilize when you're ready, and then people make the mistake of doing it, and then doing it immediately again afterwards, and not understanding why they don't get the same results. Well, you've now adapted to that volume, so that same exact volume isn't going to do it for you again. You're going to need to transition for a little bit. So I apologize. I know you didn't ask about that program, but I think it's something that people do a lot that I wanted to touch on briefly.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks for covering that one as well. One question, we're gonna cover daily undulating periodization a bit later, but one quick question, because you mentioned it already, is the progression over a training week from 9 reps, 7, 5, 3. By definition, shouldn't daily undulating use some type of non-linear trend? So in this case, the reps drop linearly. Shouldn't you introduce something that's like 7, 3, 5, 9 or something like that?
So yeah, I think that programs can do that, but typically the research hasn't done that. If we look at Rhea's study, they had an undulation pattern of 8-6-4. Montero's study had an undulation pattern that went down, quote, linearly, if you will. They had 2 training days a week and then went to 3. So you could do that. There's no rule that says you have to go down linearly, or that you can't go, let's say a 7, 3, 5 or something like that throughout the week if you have a frequency of 3 times per week. Now, of course, there's so many things to bring up here to understand that this is conceptual. We have to understand that frequency, a lot of times I'll talk about, quote, daily undulating periodization, if you will, in a frequency of 3 times a week. And I'll say, hey, we have an undulation pattern of 9, 7, 5, which is 9 reps on Monday, 7 reps on Wednesday, and 5 reps on Friday. So I want to distinguish something in a moment, but the first thing is that frequency is flexible. So the worst comment that I'll get is I'll work with somebody for a while, and then they'll say, hey Mike, I can't train 3 times per week anymore on the lifts. My schedule's changed, so I can't do daily undulating periodization anymore. So thanks for your time. It was great, but I have to stop working with you. I said, well, so my response is, I just say to my computer, I just said, so you didn't learn anything in this entire time that we worked together. So the point is that the concept is all-encompassing, meaning it's flexible. So if you do, let's say, 10 reps on Monday and then 6 reps on Friday, well, you still utilized an undulating periodization model within that. But moreover, your undulation pattern doesn't have to fit neatly within 1 week. Let's say you have an undulation pattern of 10, 7, and 4. you train Monday, you train Thursday, and then you train the next Tuesday. Well, now it's just taken 9 days to get through the 10-7-4 undulation pattern. So you do 10s on Monday, you do 7s on Thursday, you do 4s on Tuesday, and then that next Thursday you do 10s again. So it just takes you longer to get through an undulation pattern, and your undulation pattern, like the Smolov-based mesocycle, could also make up 4 different repetition ranges, the 9, 7, 5, and 3 that they have there as well. So we have to understand the flexibility of this concept is pretty enormous. But what I'd like to touch on is when you talk about the undulation pattern as you did, and should it go down linearly or should it kind of be staggered in a way, is that we have to start to distinguish a little bit between what I like to call daily undulating periodization and daily undulating programming. And I think they're different. Daily undulating periodization means you're changing between hypertrophy, strength, and power type of sessions. So we have definitions of those terms depending on your sport, if you're a powerlifter, if you're a team sport athlete, whatever you might be. And when you're using a daily undulating periodization model, you're changing between those phases each time. However, what we use more frequently, and probably should be using more frequently in terms of the powerlifting type of realm where I typically program for, is a daily undulating programming model. And that is what you and I just talked about, Mladen, which is you can have an undulation pattern of, let's say, 10, 8, 6 if you have a frequency of 3 times throughout a week, but each of those days don't necessarily fit neatly into our old school definitions of hypertrophy, strength, and power. And this is where we really, really start to talk about integrating periodization models together. So let's just say we have somebody that starts on January 1st and they're going to peak for a competition that is at the end of July. Well, over this time, here's what we're going to do. I'm going to demonstrate briefly how we can integrate all of these concepts of periodization into that macro cycle throughout that period of time. So we have an undulating programming model within a week, which means, let's just say for the sake of argument, we have a frequency of 3 times a week because this is very easy to explain. But of course, that frequency can be manipulated and should be manipulated based upon the training status of the lifter. So we start in January. We have an undulation pattern. We train Monday, Wednesday, Friday on the squat, for example, just for simplicity's sake. Now, so within the week, the repetitions change and the intensity changes. So let's say we have, on Monday we're doing 10 reps, Wednesday we're doing 8 reps, Friday we're doing 6 reps. And let's say the intensities are 65 on Monday, 70 on Wednesday, and 75 on Friday. So as the reps go down throughout the week, the intensities go up. And then as the next week starts, week 2, the intensities are going to go back down and the reps are going to go back up. So we're using an undulating programming model within a week, but over the course of time from January until the end of July, the volume will gradually decrease and the intensity will gradually increase. What I mean is, let's say we have our first mesocycle of 4 weeks, we have an undulation pattern of 10, 8, 6. Well, then the next 4 weeks, we might have an undulation pattern of 9, 7, 5. And then the next 4 weeks, we might have an undulation pattern of 8, 6, and 4. So each individual week, we have the repetitions undulating, and we have that undulating programming strategy and that undulation pattern within the week, and the intensities are changing. But over time, the volume and the repetitions are gradually decreasing. 10, 8, 6 in the first block, 9, 7, 5 in the next block, and then 8, 6, 4 in the next block, until eventually intensity crosses over volume as the primary variable. And that's exactly what happens in a linear periodization model. So instead of having a model where we have volume that gradually declines in a straight line, it actually has pulses, if you will, that it's going up and down. It's pulsatile. Like, I hope this makes sense to people that are listening, but hormones are released, like cortisol, for example, is released in a pulsatile fashion. So the diurnal variation is to go down throughout the course of when you're awake. Well, that's what volume does in this linear macro cycle, but it's pulsing, if you will, rather than just going in a straight line. So once intensity crosses over volume, that's when we change our block periodization as well. So when volume was higher than intensity, that's what we call the preparatory phase, and we do volume blocks. But within the volume blocks, the reps are undulating. Eventually, let's say at the beginning of May, if our competition's at the end of July, at the beginning of May, intensity will cross over volume. That's when we're in our peaking phase and where we run intensity blocks. So, and then in intensity blocks, our undulation patterns are probably more of 6-4-2 or 5, 3, and 1 throughout the week, or now let's say specificity is increasing. So now we've gone to a model where we have a 5, 3, 2 undulation, and then maybe a fourth day where we're working up to a weekly max or something like that. It doesn't mean you always have to do that. This concept is hugely flexible and dependent upon training status. But the point is, we just demonstrated, or we just laid out there, and I'm actually very proud. I gave a talk on this at the National Strength and Conditioning Association conference, and I'm looking at a slide I made to show this right now as I talk about it, and I'm hoping to put this as a figure in one of our papers coming up here. But what we did was we just laid out how these concepts can and should be integrated. So when you have daily undulating programming and you distinguish that between daily undulating periodization, you realize that an undulating of the reps within a week can still fit into a linear and block macro cycle, if you will. The other way the other thing to integrate into this is autoregulation and RPE. So let's say we're in a volume block, and if I say the term volume block, we now know that we're in the preparatory phase, which is at the beginning of the year. So for the listeners, I would ask you a question. In the preparatory phase, would our undulation pattern be high reps or low reps? It would be high reps, because high reps are easier to achieve a certain amount of volume. Now, within that volume block of the preparatory phase, you could assign percentages, as I did, if you recall, in the first mesocycle. We had an undulation pattern of 10, 8, 6, and then we had intensities of 65, 70, and 75. But you don't have to use percentages to assign the training load. You can use an RPE. What I mean is, in a volume block, since volume is predicated on doing repeated efforts, you should probably stick to lower RPEs, meaning, let's say, somewhere between 5 and 8. So you should have between 2 and 6 reps left in the tank on those, especially on the last set, if you will, of that volume block, to ensure you're not overstressing yourself. The physiological strain isn't too much during that volume block. So now we've also integrated autoregulation in there. And of course, you can use autoregulation to progress the training load within the weeks itself. So that gets back to one of our first points today, which is that autoregulation is not a periodization model in and of itself. It's a way to assign training load. So what we've just done is we've said, hey, we've gone from January to July, and we've integrated all these concepts of periodization. And one other thing I'd like to touch on here is, I think this model illustrates why it is important to undulate the repetitions within a week. And one, I think the data shows that, but two, I would say that if you want to peak more quickly, an undulating programming strategy is helpful for that. Because if you're in a block where you're doing 10s or 8s almost solely, and then you want to go to another block and do 4s, well, that's a huge change. Whereas if I'm doing 10, 8, 6, and then I need to peak more quickly, and I want to go to a block where I have an undulation pattern of 6, 4, and 2, well, I can do that a little easier because I've already gotten into a little bit higher intensities with the 6s that week, or that previous mesocycle, so it's not as big of a change, whereas if I was only doing 10s and then I wanted to go into 4s and 2s. So I think the undulating programming strategy gives you that flexibility to do that and to peak more frequently if you're a powerlifter that might have 3, 4 meets in a year. But I think keeping what I like to call an RPE theme on a block is important as well. So if we're in the preparatory phase and we have volume blocks, our RPE theme will be submaximal. And then if we're in a peaking phase and we have an intensity block, our RPE theme won't be 10, let's say, but it will be closer to a 10. So we can get into the high intensities and peak for the competition, and that's when we might use RPE and autoregulation a little bit more to get into work into some 9.5 and some 10 RPEs, and while we're autoregulating the training load as we get closer. So anyways, that's a very long answer to, I have no idea what the question was you asked a little bit ago, but I wanted to explain the conceptual understanding, and that's the most important word, the conceptual understanding of this. This is such a flexible concept, and we have to consider so many factors into periodization, which is why anymore when somebody says, hey, do you do linear periodization or undulating periodization? I say, well, hold on a second. It's really hard to answer just one over the other. It's a much better thing to talk about the overarching concept and how these things can and should be integrated together. So I hope all of that made sense, but it's very possible that it didn't make any sense at all.
Yeah, you make a lot of sense, and you brought up a couple of concepts I wanted to discuss. One of them is the one that you have a cycle where, let's call it a quicker cycle, where, as you said, instead of focusing on blocks, where when you do only 10 reps or you do lower number of reps, you're able to peak easily, or you transition from one phase to another phase. And I guess I mentioned a couple of times, I've been reading some stuff on project management, and in project management there's a kind of like a battle between waterfall method, where you plan in advance long cycles and everything, and the agile method that splits that into a more iterative, if that's the right way to pronounce, iterative process. And that kind of reminds me of that, because sometimes with training we are not aware of what's going to happen in the near future, so we have a lot of uncertainty and volatility, especially when you start a training plan. And as you said, if something happens, there's the change in the meet there, especially in a team sports, or just talking powerlifting now. If there's a change in a meet, the meet is cancelled, the meet is moved, you want to try another meet, then you can easily switch to a peaking phase, because you're already doing those, kind of injecting those higher intensity, lower number of reps sets. But on the flip side, this is something I want to mention, and I have it actually in the questions, but I want to cover it now, is the concept of saturation. So if you kind of mix, it's not a huge mix, you're still progressing over the blocks. You provide that small variation, as you said, small waves inside the volume across the week, and there's a trend over a longer period of time. But just, there's a concept of saturation where you actually want to really hit those certain, let's say, volumes inside a given week or within a given training period. Again, it's a battle between these, saturating certain qualities compared to hitting multiple qualities using a daily undulating programming or daily undulating periodization. So again, depends what do you want. If you want to be more able to peak quickly, when you have uncertainty in a training plan or program, or when you really want to, you have a really laid out plan and then you really want to saturate certain things. So what are your opinion on that?
Yeah, I think two things. One, I think having an undulating programming strategy certainly allows you to move from block to block a little bit more fluidly, as we discussed. But it'll keep you from losing too much of a certain adaptation. So especially if your main goal is strength, I think you should never really lose sight of that. So you should kind of almost always have some sort of strength-focused a day, if you will, or lower repetition day within that undulation pattern, or at least lower to an extent. But again, it will have kind of an RPE theme, a block. So even though you're working with, let's say, 5 or 6 reps, it'll still be submaximal. But having that lower repetition day won't completely deacclimate you, if that's a word, if you will, from the heavier loads. When you go to the next block, you'll still be able to kind of be ready with it and be able to work with it rather than having just a huge jump. The other thing you brought up at the beginning of the last segment there was the long-term planning, and we can't always know what's to come. We can't always know our fluctuations and so forth, and how we're feeling and how we're going to act on things and how we're going to react to things, if you will. And I think that's important because I think we get into a problem of saying, hey, I'm going to sketch out this entire year of training, and that almost never works. How often has somebody out there that's listening put together a 7 months of training or whatever it is, and you've calculated out exactly what the load is you're going to be squatting this week, benching this week, and all of a sudden, before you know it, you look at it and in month 4 or 5, you're like, oh my God, I'm going to be the strongest person in the world. I'm going to be bench pressing 300 kilos for 5 reps if I just keep adding 10 kilos every week. This is amazing. And then you make it 2 weeks into that program and you look at it and you say, this is terrible. This is never going to work. So I think we get a problem where we try to plan too far in advance. Now, we can and we should plan conceptually in advance. So if I get somebody that comes to me in January and they say, hey, I'm going to have a meet that's in May, and I'm going to have another meet that's in September, and then I'm going to have another meet that's in December. Well, I won't program exact sets and reps, but I will know conceptually, okay, volume's going to be high at this time, intensity's going to be high at this time, the reps should be about here at this time. So conceptually, if we understand the integrated periodization macro cycle that we spoke about a few minutes ago, you'll be able to lay out the concepts of where volume and intensity will be relatively. But that's going to be a fluid process, and the reps and sets that you will program will change throughout. Also, the volume needs to be specific to the individual. Somebody might say, hey, what's the optimal volume? Well, you can't really answer that question, nor should you. It depends upon their training status. So, we can't get into the issue, we don't want to have the issue of planning too specific in advance. We can plan conceptually in advance, but it shouldn't be too specific in advance. But having the undulating model allows for so much more flexibility if you do have to change things on the fly. So I do believe that having a programming strategy within the week, or an undulating programming strategy, is the way to go, but always keeping in mind that it's within the linear macro cycle.
Makes sense. I wanted to touch a bit on one article that Dan Baker wrote about, can't remember actually the name, but he mentioned that there are a couple of variations and progressions, and one that he mentioned is that weekly progression. So basically, if you have a day one where you do squats, let's say 3 sets of 5, and then the second day where you hit the same, let's call it movement pattern or a squat pattern, you can alternate a little bit. You can use higher volume, you can use different reps, you can do, let's say, a pause squats, you can do bands, you can do chains, you can inject some type of variability. So my question is that how does this normal variability or variation that happens within a week differentiates between the daily undulating programming? So in daily undulating programming, you're just changing the reps, or the other variability can come into play, like changing the range of movement, changing the tempo, changing the using bands or things like that. How does that fit in daily undulating programming?
Yeah, it fits in beautifully. I think this is another misconception. I think some misconceptions are my fault because I'm associated with this terminology, but I don't really post on the internet or release programs and things like that, because I'm mostly focused on taking care of my students at the university and things like that first. But I think the misconception is, so daily undulating programming or daily undulating periodization, people say is, you do the main lifts 3 times a week. No, not at all. That's not at all what it means. What it means is you're undulating the phases, or you're undulating the reps within a week when you're doing the same muscle group, let's say. But you don't have to do the same lifts. It gives you the flexibility to do the same lifts within a week if you want. And typically I'm programming for powerlifters. So powerlifting, if you will, is very easy in the grand scheme of, Mladen, I know you work with team sports. It's very easy to program for when you also consider team sports, because we have much less to account for as powerlifters. We know exactly the nature of the competition. You're going to be doing these 3 lifts. There's nobody else. It's not like a soccer match where there's a defense that you have to play against and you have to prepare for that specific team. You can replicate the competition lifts in the gym. So I typically utilize the main lifts and then assistance work when necessary. But undulating periodization fits into Baker's model, of course. So if you want to squat one day on Monday and then squat with chains or squat with bands on Thursday, or do box squats, you can still undulate that and have a hypertrophy type day on Monday, and then a strength focused or a strength specific day later in the week, or a power specific day in between those, and then a strength specific day later on Friday or Saturday, and change the exercises but are hitting the muscle groups each time. That's fantastic. And it's just going to depend on what exactly you're training for if you're going to do that. And if you're doing that as a powerlifter, you would certainly probably use those variety of exercises as you're farther out from a meet. The one thing we didn't talk about, of course, with periodization is that specificity should increase over time. And if you're a team sport athlete, remember, people lose sight of this. We think as powerlifters or bodybuilders, whatever it might be in this strength sports, that team sport athletes, are utilizing these main lifts, and they certainly should. But utilizing variations of them sometimes might be more specific for the sports that they're using. So undulating programming and undulating periodization, there is no rule that exists that says that you have to utilize this on the main lifts and you have to do those lifts multiple times within a week. You can. You certainly can. And if you're a powerlifter, I believe that you should. But there's no rule that states that. This is a concept that can be extrapolated to any sport, and it's so flexible when you're utilizing that. And that's why I think there's a huge misconception when people look at these things all the time. And, most powerlifters have to take into account that, our sport, if you will, is a very niche sport. These periodization concepts were mostly created for team sports. I know in one other thing, I'm not sure how many people know about me, but, I played soccer in college. I played NCAA soccer, and people would always ask me, nowadays, so when did you start getting into powerlifting? Did you do powerlifting meets in college? And my response, half jokingly, is no. I played real sports in college. Meaning that I got into powerlifting when I couldn't take team sports any farther. So Baker's model is fantastic. And how you progress things, and you can utilize different variations of that lift within a week. The one other thing it made me think of, Martin, that you mentioned in Baker's model, and I don't want to speak for him. I'm not exactly sure if this is how he does that. But, when we take progression, let's just, for the sake of simplicity, let's just talk about doing the squat, the exact lift 3 times per week with an undulation pattern of 8-6-4. Well, I want to talk about ways to progress here, the load from week to week. There's a few ways we can do this. One is to just simply add an arbitrary amount of weight. Let's say 2.5 or 5 kilos from week 1 to 2. That's fine. The next way to do it is to just utilize RPE. Just record an RPE on the last set of each day, and the lower the RPE, the greater the progression. Meaning, let's say on the 8-6-4 undulation pattern on the 4th day, which is a Friday, you record an RPE of 5. Well, that's very submaximal, and if you're in a volume block and your goal is to keep the RPE at 8 or under, you can take a fairly aggressive increase, maybe 5 or 7.5 kilos to the next week. The other way to progress is from Dr. Mann's study, which is APRE, or Auto-Regulatory Progressive Resistance Exercise, and we use this in our latest study as well. But that is to utilize a plus set, or the internet calls it an AMRAP set, but I hate the internet, so I call it a plus set. And that would be on the last set of that, set of that 4th day. You would do as many as you can. And if you get, let's say the baseline reps you need to get is 4. If you get 9 or 10 reps, you might take a 7.5 kilo jump from week 1 to 2. If you get 7 to 8 reps, you take a 5 kilo jump. If you would get 5 to 6 reps, you'd take a 2.5 kilo jump, and 4 reps, you'd stay the same. So that's very straightforward, and those are different ways to progress, and they all have efficacy. Again, people say, hey, which one is right? Neither one is right or wrong. There's places for all of them. I know in novice lifters, I like to just add an arbitrary amount of weight of 2.5 or 5 kilos because they're going to progress so rapidly that if you use the APRE model, I think in some of them you can increase the volume too much too soon, and you don't necessarily want that. However, in experienced lifters, the APRE model becomes a necessity, and it's just a fantastic tool. But the reason I brought that up is you also don't have to progress each day within that week the same. So what I mean is, let's say you get a bodybuilder, and they have an undulation pattern of 10, 7, and 4. Well, before a bodybuilder starts, this type of training, it's probable, not always, but it's probable that they've been training with higher reps, so they're much better at doing 10 reps than they are doing 4 reps because their motor unit recruitment efficiency probably isn't great if they've been typically training with higher reps and they're not acclimated to the lower reps. So what you could do is you could record RPEs, if you will, on all days, on the 10, 7, and 4 days, but let's say they're doing repeated 10s at 65% or 70%. Well, that's probably going to be very easy for them, and they're recording RPEs of, let's say, 5. Now, if they're doing 4s at 80% or 85%, this is probably going to be much harder for them, and let's say they're now recording RPEs of 8. Well, if they record an RPE of 5 on the last set of the 10s day, an RPE of 8 on the 4s day, it doesn't make sense to progress both of them the same way. So on the 10s day, where they record an RPE of 5, I might take a 5 or 7.5 kilo jump. On the 4th day, when they record an RPE of 8, I might only take a 2.5 kilo jump or even keep the load the same as they progress, and then the load will kind of normalize between days when they start hitting similar RPEs. So if you have better muscular endurance than you do, let's say, neural efficiency at the heavy loads or vice versa, you can progress the days independently of each other depending on how you're performing those. And I think that's something that's lost a little bit with a lot of people. I know I've been utilizing that with some clients lately, and then the days and the RPEs tend to normalize with each other over time. But I think that's important as well, to just show that this concept is very flexible when understanding periodization and understand how to progress things from week to week. I think a lot of people understand, hey, I need to have this undulation pattern, or maybe it should fit within my volume block in my linear macro cycle, but then they lose it a little bit when they progress and how to progress. And that's another thing that we can't necessarily write out even a 6-week mesocycle, because the progression, you're going to need the previous week's data to determine the progression a lot of the time.
Yeah, that makes sense. I've been making mistakes such as those numerous times, using a too prescriptive approach and chasing numbers just because they're on the sheet. And I'll try to find something that still has a consistency, it has a progression or structure over a longer period of time, but also gives me some wiggle room from day to day.
Absolutely. Lana, do you mind if I jump in with one comment before I forget?
That's why I have you here.
Thank you. By the way, I'm trying to fight off my best friend, otherwise known as my dog right now, because she is whining quite a bit, because we're not having playtime together. But so if you hear some whining, it's not me, or it's me maybe because I'm hungry, but it very well could be her. What I wanted to bring up there was, when we talk about all these things, and we just, we've really talked about quite a bit here in terms of understanding, how to integrate models, and then understanding how to progress maybe one day differently than the other day. What we have to understand, which I think is a huge problem, and there's a huge push, obviously, to look into research for stuff, and which is fantastic. I can't stress enough how great that is. But we have to also realize that when we're utilizing research to put into our training, we have to understand it conceptually. It's not the end-all be-all. We don't take a program from a study and do that exact program. So you have to have both the scientific experience or the ability to rely on research. And everything that you do should be based upon that concept in research. If it's not, then you need to reevaluate what you're doing. But you have to have the practical experience to know how to incorporate the research findings into the program. So there's no study out there that necessarily tells us, hey, you should progress, if you have an undulation pattern of 3 times a week, progress this day exactly this much, while progress, the tens day, as we just said, 5 kilos, and progress the Friday day, the fours day, 2.5 kilos. But from experience, you understand that what you're doing is based upon all of those concepts, but that one day, because of your ability, might need to progress a little more than another day. So I just think it's so important to understand things conceptually, and also to realize that in science, if two, and I can elaborate more, but it's very difficult to do some of these studies, but if 2 models of periodization, if you will, are being, and it's hard to call something a model of periodization in 6 or 8 weeks, because periodization is really a longer term. But if 2 models of periodization are being compared against each other, and one shows better results than the other, that doesn't say that that's the most optimal thing of all time. All it's saying is that model A produced better results than model B, and then your job is to find out why. And if you can answer why, then you've understood the concept, and then you should apply that concept into your program. And that's the most important thing that we can take from research is, okay, this conceptually seemed to yield better results than this concept. So we need to take concept A that was better, and how do we now incorporate that in to make it feasible for us to do? And it's not a magic set and rep scheme that study did. It showed a concept, and it showed a reason why. So you need to understand that and then put that into play. So we have to have both the research aspect of it, and everything should be based on that. But also, if you're writing programs, you're going to get proficient at it by writing programs, many of them over time, and understanding the subtle adjustments you need to make that are based on the concept that you find. So I hope that makes sense, but I wanted to bring that up for a second.
Yeah, thanks for doing that. One thing I wanted to cover, and sometimes just bugs me a couple of times and keeps coming back, is that one thing that really helped me out in my career was a book called Practical Programming, also by authors of Starting Strength, Mark Ripto and Glenn Pendley, and can't remember the name of the third author. So anyway, they proposed basically 3 or 4 levels of the lifter, and also propose a couple of principles when it comes to planning and programming of training for each phase of the lifter or the level. And that keeps coming back to my mind. How is that correct, and how that could be implemented. And when I see other programs, I always think about, is this for a novice, for intermediate, or advanced? And then you come up with your daily undulating periodization and basically screw me up. So I usually need to kind of go through a whole process a couple of times in my head, just to try to find a model that kinds of either accept new ideas and new insights, or I need to change the model. And I actually wanted to interview you because some of these issues that I've been having, and how we can implement, or should we implement, those ideas by practical programming and Mark Crypto when it comes to levels of the lifters. For example, the novice, as you said, the starting strength is a great program for them. Then we have the intermediate lifter, where the speed of progression is slowing down, and the need for variety in training is increasing, as well as volume is increasing. The volume need is increasing. But they also, implement something that's called hard, medium, easy. You're probably familiar with that. And that's basically daily undulations. So I think it comes from, what's the name of the book? Stronger Shall Survive, right? From, I think it's a football coach who wrote it, using a hard, medium, easy. But then as you progress through to higher level lifter, not in terms of weight, but in terms of progression speed, then those small cycles where we have days like a volume day, intensity day, and recovery day, they are kind of spreading to longer phases. Then you have like a volume phase, as you mentioned, you have intensity phase, and maybe recovery phase. And I've been just trying to wrap my head around those concepts, and I was looking forward to your input. What can you say about those things?
Sure. I was just jotting some notes down here while you were talking to make sure I didn't forget. I think actually the Practical Programmer for Strength, I'm familiar with that. I think Lon Kilgore is the other author, if I'm correct.
Yeah, exactly.
So let's kind of go from novice up through, advanced here, if you will. So in novice lifters, I think it's very, very important to point out that periodization is not important. Progressive overload is important. Staying short of failure is important. Inducing the repeated bout effect, which is the attenuation of muscle damage with continued training. All of those things are very important. But if you have a novice lifter and you're trying to worry about optimizing the exact undulation pattern or periodization scheme within that week, it just does not matter. I can't stress that enough. Remember, if somebody is a novice and they haven't done anything, well, if they just do something, they are going to make progress, right? I always use the example for my students, for my class of, currently I do zero endurance training. Although I am a recovering endurance athlete, I've been sober since 2009 when I ran my last marathon. So I'm feeling much better these days. My disease of endurance training has subsided. But I always make the example to my class, which is that, I do zero endurance training currently. So what should I do to progress with endurance exercise? Well, if I just simply ran 1 mile a week, I would make a ton of progress very quickly because I currently do nothing. So it's like a novice lifter that comes into the gym. If they were to just go do 3 sets of 10 on something once a week, and they currently did no exercise whatsoever, would they make progress? Of course they would. Now, that doesn't mean that you should only do 3 sets of 10 when you're starting out, but it does mean that, yeah, it would work. You would certainly make progress. So I think in a novice individual, the important thing is not say, hey, we need to have this undulation pattern. And I think that's why starting strength is so good, because it doesn't worry about that. It focuses on the main lifts, and it focuses on appropriate progression and progressive overload. So in a novice lifter, you can stay well short of failure on the RPE scale of, let's say, 5 or even less than 5, stay well short of failure. Now, novices typically aren't going to be very good at using the RPE scale. So if you were coaching them, I would have you yourself assign the RPE to them and have them assign their own RPE and see if they match up, because typically they're going to be way off on an RPE. So they have to have a skill of learning it. But in a novice lifter, staying short of failure, working on technique, adherence to training, inducing the repeated bout effect, essentially getting the protective effect against muscle damage is important. And they can also make progress on such a little amount of volume. You know, we talk about volume, and I say certainly volume is the variable that strength and growth are most closely related to, and that is true. However, you should make progress on as little volume as you can for as long as you can, and volume should progress over time. So a quick example is if we gave let's say we have an intermediate or more experienced lifter, and they've integrated all the periodization strategies, and we have a macro cycle that goes from January till the end of July, like we talked about. Let's say January 1 is block 1. We do an intro cycle first, but then we have block 1 where we have an undulation pattern of 10, 8, 6. Well, when volume should be higher is in macro cycle 2, let's say that next macro cycle starts at the beginning of August. Well, in August, when they go back to that first volume block, that's when volume should be a little bit higher than it was the previous January. When they're at the same time in that cycle, during the second macro cycle, is when volume should be a little higher. So it's a gradual progression of volume, but it is there and it is over time, but it's appropriate to the individual. They're making progress on as little volume as you can for as long as you can. If you're jumping from 5,000 kilos of volume in a block to 20,000 kilos, on our particular lift, let's say bench press, to 20,000 kilos, and the next time you're in that phase of the cycle, of the macro cycle, well, that's inherently not going to be good, because you, for two reasons. One, you increase the injury risk because that's such a huge amount of stress that you're not adapted to yet. But two, if you do adapt to that, you're going to make progress, sure, but now you've adapted to that 20,000 kilos of volume, and it's hard to go back. And you've missed out on all of the progress you could have made, from 5,000 to 20,000, and you've probably stunted your long-term progress for a little bit of short-term progress. So it's not necessarily the way that we want to do things. We want to gradually change things, over time. Whereas if somebody says, hey, we've done some data, some research looking at daily max training, and it's certainly effective, and this is a much bigger concept, but somebody says, hey, can I do this? Well, you can, but if you're an intermediate lifter, why would you want to do that? You don't need to do it yet. So why would you want to adapt to something that you don't need, and why would you want to work harder than you have to? So novices, periodization is simply not important. Focus on those more important things, overload specificity, and so forth. And then the intermediate is when periodization certainly becomes more important, but we have to realize that we want to progress volume appropriately. And then in the advanced lifters, I would say, are when the subtle changes can make a difference, and where utilizing an auto-regulated strategy to program load might even become more important, especially as you're leading up to a meet. If we're leading up to a meet and we're in intensity block and we have an undulation pattern Monday, Wednesday, Friday of, let's say, 5, 3, and 1, and we have a plus set, or that AMRAP set, if you will, on the ones day, and somebody gets 5 reps, that's great. That means they've gotten stronger. But if that's the week before a meet, it's going to be very, very difficult to gauge your attempts off of something that you did 5 reps. Maybe not very difficult, but it's not what you want. So if somebody does that ones day, what you might do is have them work up to a single at a 9.5 RPE or a double at a 9.5 RPE. That way, if they've gotten a lot stronger during that intensity block, you can now estimate a pretty solid 1RM, and you can utilize that to gauge your attempt selection as you go into the next competition. So, or even a regular test day if you're an athlete that's just testing the following week or whatever it may be. So I think that kind of takes us through looking at different strategies for the novice, the intermediate, and the advanced lifters. I don't think the overarching concept of periodization changes from an intermediate to an advanced. However, how you might apply it and the subtle intricacies of using an auto-regulation strategy might be different in a experienced versus a novice, and what RPEs you might have them work to might be different. In experience versus an intermediate lifter, whereas in a novice, periodization is important. So the conceptual understanding of periodization doesn't change, but we have to realize that the subtle intricacies of how we program it can change. And before I forget too, one other thing on RPE. And using this scale is a huge skill. How often have you seen somebody grind out a rep or maybe even miss a rep or get close to missing it and say, what was your RPE? And they say, real confident. They say 7. And I just stare at them. I stare at them like my dog is staring at me right now, asking me why we're not having fun. And I said to her, we're talking about science, this is fun, and she still seems confused. But they say 7, and I look at them, I say, no, you missed, it was an 11. This is not a debate, this is not a negotiation, and they don't fully understand that. So before you can let somebody run wild with this concept, you have to make sure that they're appropriately utilizing it. So what I often have them do is have them record an RPE on a submaximal load and me record an RPE on the submaximal load and then match them up to see if they coincide with each other. Or if I know somebody, if I say, hey, I want you to work up to a 9 RPE single on a deadlift, and then I'll get an email from them and says, hey, I missed. I really thought, I said, what do you mean you missed? It's impossible. I just want you to work to a 9. I don't care if it's 100 kilos or if it's 300 kilos. Just work to the 9 for that day. So if I have that, what I'll do is, I know that person can't necessarily hold back. I'll determine what I believe for them is going to be a 9 on that day, and then I'll take maybe 5 to 10 kilos off of it and just say, hit this number. And that way, again, it's understanding things conceptually. They're going to work to the appropriate strain, the appropriate stress. But if you know your lifter, you can make sure they don't go over it, because you don't want to rely on them to use a scale that they're not comfortable with, or they're going to overshoot it, or something like that. So, man, all of those things, that's a lot at one time. But those are really the concepts that vary maybe a little differently from novice to intermediate to advanced, and then how to utilize some of these things depending on the nature of your lifter and their mindset going in.
Yeah, that makes sense. One concept I want to touch also is reps in reserve, and how's that affecting, or exertion as I like to call it, how's that affecting the programming for different levels of the lifters? For example, for novice, like for very novice athlete, just hitting the heavy 9 or heavy 10, 3 times a week, shouldn't be, much difficult, because they cannot tax themselves too much. For individual, you need to kind of spread those, as you like to call them, also the N plus sets, right? But for the advanced, you don't want to really go there too often or too quickly. You want to save those for those peaking cycles or intensity cycles. And that's one concept I want to touch with you, especially taking into account this high frequency training and daily maximum training. What are your thoughts about these? Like the connection between reps in reserve or exertion level to training frequency and volume, as well as a level of the lifter.
Sure. I think you used our term there, which is fantastic, which is repetitions in reserve. So our paper that was published ahead of print in the Journal of Strength and Conditioning Research not that long ago is titled, Novel Resistance Training Specific RPE Scale Measuring Repetitions in Reserve. So essentially what we've done is we've combined RPE and RIR, and we can't take credit for inventing this. All the credit goes to Mike Zourdos and Reactive Training Systems for bringing this concept to light. RPE has been around in exercise physiology as we teach it for a long time, but it's been more predicated on light effort, moderate effort, heavier effort, maximal effort, and that has limitations in a resistance training setting, because people typically indicate effort with how heavy they're breathing, how fatigued they feel, rather than maximal exertion on a 1 rep max, which doesn't really tax you in a cardiovascular sense. It rather taxes you in a muscular sense. So Mike T, when he published his Reactive Training System manual, that was a game changer for the way we can think about some things. And so we were the first to kind of integrate a RIR-based RPE combined scale into the scientific literature, which was inspired by what they had done, and then we investigated it in these populations. So I think repetitions in reserve is a fantastic way to think about it, and we tried to utilize that term quite a bit in our paper. So an RIR-based RPE scale. Now, when we talk about the different populations, as we just did, but going back to it, certainly a novice lifter could hit let's say, a 9 RPE a couple times throughout a week if they wanted to. And if they did that, they would progress really quickly because, the neuromuscular increases would be very rapid. Their ability to utilize the high threshold motor units that they had would be much better if they were working up to the 9 RPEs, whereas if they weren't doing much before. So essentially, to improve, let's say, the neuromuscular factors, even in an advanced lifter leading up to a meet, if you were to take a weekly max or a weekly 9.5 RPE on a lift, well, you would progress and you would peak for that meet. It's not necessarily inducing hypertrophy, but the neuromuscular increases in your ability to adapt to that load at that single repetition would improve pretty rapidly, not forever, but for a few weeks as you were to lead up to a competition. So a novice lifter could do this as well. I don't know how much I would utilize this in a novice lifter because they don't need that to progress. I like to progress people on as little intensity or volume as they can. I don't want them to work harder than they have to or stress themselves more than they have to. The other issue with a novice lifter working to these higher RPEs is they're not good at gauging the RPEs. So you don't want them. The problem is our data shows in that study I just mentioned, oftentimes novice lifters aren't really capable of recording an RPE that's higher than 8, 8.5, or 9. And what will happen is they'll work to an RPE of 8.5, and they'll record that, which means they could do between 1 and 2 more reps, and then you'll increase the load 2.5 kilos, and they'll fail. The reason they'll fail is they don't have the high threshold motor unit recruitment yet, or the efficiency, if you will, to go up that and to utilize the heavier weights. So it's just also if somebody has a max of, let's say you're estimating their max around 100 kilos and you increase 2.5 or 5 kilos, well, that's 2.5 or 5% of their 1RM. So they fail pretty rapidly when you go above that. So I like to keep them progressing on as little intensity and volume as they can. If we jump up to an experienced lifter and we talk about utilizing higher intensities with them, well, I think certainly right before competition as we're peaking, we obviously need to get into them. But that's typically when, if I have an undulation pattern of, let's say, training 3 times per week, a 5, 3, and a 1, as we mentioned earlier, once we get toward the end of that intensity block, which is, of course, in our peaking phase in our linear macro cycle, I'll utilize maybe 3 weeks out a plus set, 2 weeks out a double at a 9.5 RPE, and then 1 week out a single at a 9.5 RPE. Take advantage of some of the neuromuscular benefits as they get into the heavier load, get them acclimated to it, but also what did we do there? We use an undulation pattern within the week, but just take that Monday, Wednesday, Friday, that Friday, if you will, where I just stated we have a plus set on 3 weeks out, 2 weeks out we have a double at a 9.5, and then 1 week out we have a single at a 9.5. What did we do? We used a linear strategy between those weeks. So it's just another way to integrate the models of periodization, which is from 3 weeks to 1 week, what did we do? We gradually decreased the volume, we gradually increased the intensity. So, these older school concepts will never go away. They are there for a reason because they are sound concepts. So I would certainly utilize something like that to have that individual peak as they go into a competition. Now, to the question regarding daily maximal training and things like that, I think this is something that people obviously need to proceed with extreme caution. We completed our study here and we did 3 individual cases. So we're working on trying to get that paper published now. But what we did was we looked at 37 consecutive days of squatting, and we had 36 max days of the 37 days. Days 1 to 35 were max days. Day 36 was a taper day, if you will, just a single at 80 or 85%. And then day 37 was a post-max, and then we had volume on all of those days. So just if you think about something like daily maxing, obviously it is only recommended, I don't know if it's ever recommended, but it should only be utilized by individuals that are very, very well trained and are not only ready for it physiologically, but are ready for it mentally. As someone who has a lot of experience, just myself with doing daily max cycles throughout the last 4 or 5 years or so, I can tell you that anytime I haven't been ready for it mentally, it has not worked. You have to understand what you're getting into. You have to understand the time it's going to take up in your day. So, and just to mentally prepare for it each day. So let's say you're doing just 30 days, 1 month of daily maxing. and you're ready for it. You're an experienced lifter. You have, let's say, a minimum of 5 years, maybe 10 years of training experience, and you also have a pretty good technical proficiency of the lift, and let's say we use the squat. Well, if you start out doing that, let's say the first day your max is 230 kilos, 507 pounds on day one. Well, day 2, 3, 4, 5, really that first week, you can expect a pretty sharp decrease. That doesn't mean that you're, quote, overtrained, if you will, already, or that you're weaker already. What it means is you're going through the adaptation period. You're going to have a decline maybe from 230 kilos somewhere in that week to maybe a low of 215, something like that. That would be 473 pounds, so maybe 507 to 473, maybe lower, somewhere around there. But then at around a week, 7 to 10 days, you're going to start to break out. You're going to start to come back to normalcy, match that 230, maybe increase over it a little bit and hit a peak of, let's say, 235. But then after that peak, you can probably expect another valley. That valley, though, instead of going all the way down to 215, will probably be more like 220, 225, and then you can normalize and expect another peak of maybe about 240, then another valley. But the point is that each peak is higher than the previous peak, and each valley is higher than the previous valley. So you should have a pretty good relationship between days or time and strength as you go through that 30 days. And we did find a significant and moderate to strong relationship in all three of our cases, although from day 1 to day 37, although we did also find huge fluctuations in the daily 1RM of them, even though they did all go up over time. So we have to understand that this is something that should only be used sparingly. Also, it's also not a style of periodization in and of itself. Rather, it's one mesocycle that a very experienced lifter would use as an intensity block within a linear macro cycle. But even using it as an intensity block has its limitations. If you're a powerlifter and you're utilizing this for the squat, well, certainly your ability to train the deadlift will decrease just because you're so fatigued from the squat, and your ability to train the bench press will decrease because you're going to have some nagging pains here and there, just the time. So when utilizing this, we have to understand that a daily max training or daily maximal training or daily 1RM training, however you'd like to refer to it, is not a style of periodization in and of itself. Rather, it's simply one mesocycle that would fit into a yearly macro cycle for a very, very experienced lifter. So obviously in that yearly macro cycle, we talked about preparatory phase and peaking phase, preparatory phase as volume blocks, peaking phase as intensity blocks. 1 month of this might be an intensity block. But even within that, it needs to be used very, very sparingly, because if you say, hey, I'm going to utilize this daily maximal cycle as a powerlifter to peak for a competition, that may be fine if you think about it and say, hey, I'm going to do it for the squat. But certainly if you're max squatting every day, your ability to deadlift is going to decrease. Not necessarily your strength levels, although they may, but the time you have left in your day to deadlift, your want to deadlift, your desire to do it, and maybe you're fatigued, maybe you have some little nagging injuries. And the same thing for the bench press. You might have some elbow pain from squatting so much, your ability to bench press will decrease. I know, my bench press to this day isn't very good, but it used to be not completely terrible. But I did have a pretty drastic drop-off when I first started doing daily maximal squatting, because I'd be in the gym for a very, very long period of time, and I just didn't have the want and the desire to do it. Also, I was training at night at this point with the Florida State Weightlifting Club, and when I would finish up is when the grocery store Publix would, right around the time when they stopped making chicken tender subs. If you're not familiar with this, you live a terrible life. And so there was always a debate, do I bench press or do I go get chicken tender subs? And chicken tender subs won every single time. If you're not familiar with this, email me and I'd be honored to purchase you your first chicken tender sub if you come to Florida. But the point was that squatting took so long and it was so demanding each day that my desire to bench press just wasn't there. So if you're doing this to peak for a meet, hey, you might hit an enormous squat PR, but are your other lifts going to follow suit? They may if you have nothing else to do with your day. But if you have, all of us, this is a hobby for us, for most of us, training. So we have our regular life to take care of, our jobs to take care of, our family to take care of. And so we only have so much time to train. So understand that, again, when people say, hey, compare undulating to linear periodization, well, they can and they should be integrated. But then people say, well, are you using daily 1RM training, or are you using Is that better than this type of periodization? Well, again, daily 1RM training should be integrated as one intensity block within an overarching periodization model, but of course should only be used by a few individuals very, very sparingly, and when they're really, really ready for it, at a certain point in their training career. And then there's so many other considerations of that. If you do that, and let's say you do it for 30 days, well, how do you come off of it? Because whatever you do almost is going to be a drop in frequency and a drop in volume. The volume might not be astronomical that you're doing, but you are doing a pretty decent amount of volume if you're training every day. And the one thing I should mention is that if you are maxing every day, from what we have seen, do not skip volume afterwards. Doing doubles, triples at relatively high percentages after the max each day. I can't say, because we didn't compare our data to a control group, so I can't say that it is the only way it would work. I simply don't know that. But I do think it was contributory to the success to do the volume after the daily maxes each day rather than just doing daily maxes. So how do you come off of that? You probably have to do some sort of transition cycle as you go back into some sort of higher repetition stuff or some volume phases. But if you come off of a daily max cycle and then say, hey, I'm going to go into a volume block where I have an undulation pattern of 12, 10, and 8, that's going to be hard too, because the 12s, the 10s, and the 8s are such an unaccustomed stimulus that the damage response is going to be pretty high. So you probably want to gradually build back up to the amount of reps that you're doing, so the damage and the soreness that you experience immediately coming off of the daily max cycle isn't enormous. Also, there's just... Sometimes I catch myself when I'm giving these explanations here, because I don't ever want anybody to think that there's nothing that's magical about any of this, right? It just all comes with consistent progress, consistent effort over time. So, to say, hey, 30 days of a daily max cycle, do I know that that's the best way to do it? No, I have no idea. I understand the concepts of training volume and damage and recovery, and that your body will adapt to these things. Especially if you're at a certain level of training status before you begin it. However, maybe 40 days is better than 30. Maybe 20 days is better than 30. Maybe the first time you do this, 30 days is appropriate, and then the next time you do it a year later, you're more adapted, and then 40 days is appropriate. Maybe it's better to max every other day and just do volume on the days in between to keep the everyday frequency. I don't know that. Our data didn't compare one model to another in this sense. All we did was observe and look at how this type of training does it have efficacy, and the answer is yes, it has efficacy. And we can say with confidence it should only be used in very, very well-trained lifters. It should only be used at a certain point. You have to understand that you're going to go through peaks and valleys, and when you have the valleys, that is the time when you do need to train to make sure that you adapt to it. But also, could you go too long with it? Let's say 100 days and overtrain? For sure. People say, does overtraining exist? Of course it exists. It's certainly it's much more difficult to achieve than most people think. If you're well trained and you start a daily max cycle and you have a dip in your strength at day 5, that's not overtraining. That's the initial adaptation period. Now, the way I would measure that's overreaching, if you will. The way I would distinguish between overreaching and overtraining is I like to track weekly or bi-weekly averages. And if somebody's going through this and they have a whole month where their average 1RM is consistently decreasing, let's say they try to do this for 2 months, and in the second month the average 1RM is consistently decreasing, and now you're below starting levels and you're averaging that below starting levels every week, now you've probably overtrained and taken it too far. So I'd like to avoid that point and probably taper somebody off of something like that before we've reached that. So if you can track averages per week or bi-weekly, then you can get a better gauge of that. So, I don't know why there's even argument or disagreement of if overtraining exists, of course, and two, why there's such a, you can't pinpoint it exactly maybe, but I don't think it's that difficult to understand between overreaching and overtraining. If you're overreaching, it's something that's done, probably earlier on, and you're going to see recovery from that relatively quickly. If you go with a taper or you keep training, you should adapt, and you can track your averages. But if you track your averages with daily 1 RM training, even whatever you're doing, and you're consistently decreasing over a long period, well, it's always hard to pinpoint, hey, exactly, diagnosis of overtraining, but certainly having your averages of strength levels go down over a long-term period isn't a good thing. So that's a time where you're going to need to switch something, where you're going to need to taper. In the literature, in the scientific literature, I think overtraining is much more prevalent in endurance athletes. I think it's much harder to achieve in strength athletes, but certainly it's there. And you want to try to stop the daily 1 RM training period when you've simply overreached and not overtrained. So I think going for something like 30 days, our data suggests that's a pretty safe way to do it if you're starting out with it, if it's the first time you're doing it, rather than trying to go for 100 days, which if it's the first time you're doing it, you might not mentally be prepared for that, and you could run into some trouble.
Yeah, I wanted to touch two things, and I think there's a confusion on the internets. There's I guess people are confusing the high frequency training compared to a daily max training, and they're not same. So you can probably do a high frequency training, and that's one of the things that Lyle McDonald pointed out a couple of times, because people are trying to copy Bulgarian training where you're actually going to the daily max, but you're using Olympic lifting, and according to Lyle, it's a bit easier, in a quotation mark, compared to power lifts. So I guess there is a difference between high frequency training and daily maximum training, and
I think that's very well said.
And I still wanna add up that the concept of intensiveness of exertion, or actually going balls to the wall, and how that can lead to a mental burnout, especially in a high frequency daily max training. And most of the authors point out that even on a daily max, you're not actually really pushing to a max. You are pushing to a heavy single that's actually pretty heavy, but it's maybe around 9.5 on a RPE scale. It's not really, you're not psyching up, you're not taking the salts, or listening to loud music and stuff like that, just to avoid the mental burnout. And one of my ideas basically is that, as you said, with the overtraining, it might be more emotional or mental. So people say that it's the high intensity in terms of percentage of 1 RM that's causing the overtraining, or volume. But in my opinion, there might be some mechanism involving that. But in my opinion, it might be an emotional attachment or emotional reaction to a training. So if you're psyching up for every set and you're doing that frequently, that can lead to problems. And it comes back to a question I asked you before, saving those sets later in a training plan, or not overdoing them, especially for a higher level athlete, because they can really tax themselves by hitting a heavy singles or heavy doubles or triples. And it comes back to a concept of building strength versus testing strength. What are your opinions on this?
Yeah, so I jotted down quite a few things. I'll take your last one first, building strength as opposed to testing strength. I do think that's an important concept. And, are you really building strength if you're maxing every day? I think you are in a neuromuscular sense. And I think that's why it's something that's used very, very sparingly as you're leading up to a competition. And we talked about, with an undulation pattern of, let's say, 5-3-1 within a week, and working up to a weekly 9.5 RPE single, sure. But that's not what's building your strength throughout the course of the year. The volume is building the strength throughout the course of the year. And that's still why, if you're going to do a daily max cycle, you would want to not skip the volume. So I think that's a hugely important concept, as you said, and that's where people get into trouble these days. You said the internet is confused. The internet is confused about a lot of things, my friend. This is when people get into trouble of, instead of lifting weights to build strength, they lift weights so they can post a video on the internet, and that's when they get into the problem of saying, "Hey, I'm going to test my strength each time instead of building it each time." So it's certainly much more important. The bulk of your time is going to be spent building strength rather than testing strength. And I agree with saving sets, even in a daily max cycle. You don't want to get up there, with smelling salts every day, getting overly jacked up every day. I've done this, and I can tell you from doing it that at a certain point, I just simply did not want to lift weights anymore. it was something that I experienced firsthand, saying, wow, I made progress for a long time, but then when I got a little too greedy and said, all right, I'm going to go in every day, I'm going to get overly jacked up, it's Master of Puppets every single day, it's salts every single day, and I'm going to max. And it worked for a little bit, but I just really did not want to lift weights anymore after that. So I do agree with saving sets to an extent. I think that it also depends on somebody's training status. If somebody's used to doing weekly maxes, then they can build up to working to maybe 2 heavier sessions with a couple lighter sessions during that week. And then saving sets for them might be only working up to 1 heavy max a week, rather than saving sets for another person is working up to a max every other week. It just depends on what they are trained for. But I jotted down a few other points I want to hit on here. And you talked about the difference between high frequency and high max training, and I think that's a great difference to discuss here. I know you said somebody was talking about it out there, and I think they're exactly right. Is that high frequency training? People misuse terms. Just understand what high frequency training means. It means training with frequency. If I said, people say, hey, I couldn't deadlift more than once a month. Well, of course you can. If you only deadlift once a month and then you can't recover for a whole month, that's because you only deadlift once a month. You've never tried. So the first time you try something, it's going to be a little more difficult, but you will adapt to it. But even if I said, could you go and deadlift 60 kilos for 1 rep every single day? Of course you could. You could deadlift 7 days a week. Now, that's not going to give you an adaptation, but the point is that if you periodize things appropriately, you can gradually improve that frequency. But high frequency training doesn't mean high max or daily max training. It can. Certainly daily max training means high frequency training, but high frequency doesn't necessarily mean daily max. So I agree with you that we have to distinguish between those. I also want to be very, very clear in this, that I am not recommending anything. I am not recommending anybody that's listening to say, hey, I'm going to go start daily max training today. If you do so, you certainly do so on your own volition. I think it's a very cool concept. I think it's awesome. I think it's great to consider. But I think very, very, very few people should actually utilize this. The reason being is not just because of the physiological training status that only a few people are there. Also, if you don't need it, why would you want to do it if you don't need it? But also, just you have to mentally understand what you're getting into. I know the first time that I embarked on something like this, I did it when I had a little bit of period in my life where I had a little bit more downtime and I could dedicate time to this and I could get recovery and so forth. Right now, this is not something that I could do at all in my life because I don't have time for it. I wouldn't be able to commit to it, and it would vastly inhibit the rest of my life, and the rest of my life is more important than lifting weights. So I'm not recommending this to anybody, and if you are going to do it, proceed with caution and understand that mentally it's going to be a big toll, and you may hit a point where you're just bored with it or you don't want to do it. And I certainly, nutrition is not my area, but I've heard a lot of people say, in a sense, the best diet that you have, if you will, is something that you can stick to, and I agree with that. I think if somebody is very rigid on certain foods they eat, but they can't stick to it, it might have limitations. I'm not making any nutrition recommendations, and that's the most I'll say about that because that's not my area. But I think if you do abide by that concept, I think it's similar in lifting weights. If the most optimal thing in the world is to max squat every single day and do some volume after, that's great. But if you can't stick to that, it's probably going to have detrimental effects in the long run. So you also have to utilize and realize what you can do. And that's when I always tell people, if I'm going to work with them, you tell me what works best for your schedule. You tell me your ability to train with a certain frequency. You tell me what time you go to work and so forth. And then I'll make this model conceptually be based upon the research, but will fit what you can do. And I think there's something to be said, at a certain point, somebody just needs to not be a baby man and train. But at the same time, if they don't have time in their day for this, then we have to use those concepts to make them fit what they're doing. So, I just want to be very, very clear on that. I don't want anybody to take this discussion on high frequency or daily max training and say, this is fantastic, it seems to work, I'm going to go start this today. And that it's unlikely that that's a good decision for you. It's possible, but it's very, very unlikely, and there's a lot more that goes into it. So with that, and then if you are doing the daily max, Mladen, you talked about, maybe it's not an actual max, and I think I agree with that. When we did our study, we we did not require the participants to go to a 10 RPE each day or to fail each day. We tried to minimize failure. So they had to record at least a 9.5 RPE, and it was also at the investigator's discretion if we decided that based upon, because we're also taking velocity every single day, if they should keep going. So they could work to a 9.5 or a 10 RPE on not the pre or post testing days. The pre or post testing days they had to work to a 10, but the days in between to minimize failure, and to say, yeah, it's a daily max training, but it's almost a near max training each day. Some days are a daily max if they recorded a 10. Some days were 9.5. They couldn't record a 9 just because we had to have some objective measure in our study. So if they recorded a 9, they had to go again and hit at least a 9.5. But no, we tried to minimize failure. If you're failing with this every day and going to a 10, you're getting too amped up. You are certainly not going to progress if you're failing too much. So, and you had talked about mechanistically a few things about this, and I have some theories and thoughts. But I'd like to say with all of this, a lot of this data that we talk about and everything is performance data. So a lot of mechanisms on some things are unknown. We still don't even have a complete 100% grasp on muscle hypertrophy in terms of, we know a lot of the factors involved, but maybe metabolic processes and metabolite buildup aren't as much of a driver as hypertrophy as we previously thought. But did they still play a role? I'm very confident that they still play some sort of role. So the point is that we have the data and we look at it conceptually and we understand it. But we also have to understand that even researchers in this field, in this area, some of the mechanisms we're always going to be striving for, which is I think why it's cool to continue to come up with more questions. So anyways, I know I'm straying a little bit and kind of jumping from place to place here, but I just think it's important to cover all of these things if we can.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. Thanks for sharing that. I want to touch on a thing you mentioned, that on one of your cycles where you actually did a daily max and really pushed yourself very hard, you lost the motivation to actually go to the gym. And one of my ideas, I don't know if it's mine, but maybe someone else I stole from the internet probably, is that the mental burnout might be more frequent than actual overtraining. And just bear with me for a sec. My definition is that burnout is that your performance still might be there. So the performance might not be affected, or at least not affected too much, but your actual motivation to go to lift or train is affected. That's a burnout. And with the overtraining, you are motivated, you want to go to the gym, but the performance is not there. Can what's your experience with this, and does it make sense?
It makes perfect sense. I agree with you. We should also distinguish between that mental burnout, or what one study I believe called, quote, staleness, which is also another rationale for why undulating the repetitions within a week might be more beneficial than not, just to avoid some of that staleness, if you will. But in overtraining, we can look at consistent declines in performance when we look at those weekly averages or monthly averages or so forth. Absolutely. However, I agree with you. It is very, very possible to have the mental burnout without the overtraining, without the decline in performance. In that case, you have to take somebody's well-being more into account. It's somebody would ask, why do you do this or that for training? Well, most of all, because I want to. I don't make a living off of lifting weights, nor does really anybody else. Very, very few people do that. So, your well-being should come first and foremost. And if you're not enjoying that, why would you do it? If I woke up tomorrow morning and said, hey, I want to go run 5 miles today, trust me, that's not going to happen. But if I woke up and I said I want to do this, I would go do it because I want to go. I want to do whatever I want to do. So I think the mental burnout is an important thing. The other aspect of it, even if you're not overtrained in terms of your strength levels going down, if you have the mental burnout, well, that probably opens you up to a greater injury risk because maybe you're not as focused, maybe you're not as tight during those lifts when you're using those loads if you're doing something like daily max training, and that's going to open you up to more of an injury. So I think you have to consider all of these other factors. Sometimes things look really, really good in a vacuum, but that's not necessarily how real life works. Like if you say, hey, I'm going to try to optimize, going back to the nutrition realm, I want to optimize muscle protein synthesis every second of the day. That's fine, but now you're only looking at things in a vacuum and there's so many other things to consider. Does it really matter? Is that really important? So I think in terms of, say, hey, I want to do daily 1RM training, but if it's affecting other things, and again, if it's affecting your other lifts, you're just doing this for squat, you're not doing benches, you're not doing deadlifts, did it really help your total in that sense? Maybe it didn't. So there's a lot of other things to go along with it. I know in my experience, as you mentioned, I can't remember the exact number, I've done daily maxing for, personally, I'd have to go back and look at the spreadsheet, but it's over 100 days. And toward the end of that, I got into doing it twice a day. Actually, I would train with my good friend Ben Esgro. He was actually doing daily maxing on the deadlift because he's a complete crazy person. And we would Skype or we would train together like that. Maybe for the second session of the day, I would go back in and squat for a second time, and he would deadlift. And I know toward the end of that, I would be talking to him on Skype, and my desire to be there would just be almost non-existent. So it was very, very difficult to go back for that second session of the day a lot of the time, and my performance would really, really suffer. Maybe not because my strength levels were inherently down, but just because my desire to be there wasn't good. And then I had a really drastic drop in strength after it, because just in general, I wasn't necessarily in the mood to train after that. So I think even though things look in a vacuum, it's not necessarily the way to go in the long run. That probably stunted my progress in the long run. I'm not upset with that, because the reason I did that was to answer a question for myself. So I think everything serves its purpose. If you come, even, we people on the internet talk about, well, this person doesn't understand basic periodization, they don't understand this, or they don't understand, their technique, or this about nutrition, or whatever. But there's nothing wrong with that. I mean, remember, we were all there at one point. So everything you do serves its purpose and brings you to seeing the light. So I'm very, very confident that in my own training right now, I'm doing some things incorrectly. That's just the case for all of us. But there's nothing wrong with that, because that will serve its purpose, we will learn from it, and then we will be better off later on. So it's just, even in research over the years, how many times did we think something was going to be it, and then maybe that wasn't necessarily the case as new data came out. So as I tell my students every semester, I say, hey, unfortunately, guys, something that I am telling you this semester will be shown to be wrong eventually. Maybe it will be my own data, maybe it will be somebody else's data, but something will be wrong. I think it's true now, but the point is, everything we do serves its purpose. So when I did that, in the long run for strength, or at least over the course of that year, it may not have been the best strategy, even though in 30 days it was fantastic. However, in the long run, I learned from it, and I'm better for it, and I was able to answer a question, and it served its purpose. And I know, a few things a little better now, and I know how to deal with maybe adversity in training. And the other aspect of something like that is, and this really goes into any periodization model, any training frequency, is, man, don't get so wrapped up in one down performance or one down day. Somebody goes into the gym and they're supposed to hit, 5 sets of 6 at 75% and maintain, an 8 RP or lower, and they fail on a set, or they hit an RP of 10 on a set, and they go home that night and it ruins their day. Oh my God, what happened? This is the worst. Just don't worry. It's one day. It's one day of fluctuation in the grand scheme of things. Try not to get too high. Try not to get too low when you're training. And I think if you're doing daily maxing, certainly that's very, very important. But it's important kind of in anything that you do with this. Yeah. But yeah, for sure.
As Dan John used to say, embrace the suck.
Absolutely. I as a fan of kind of all sports, and although they're struggling mightily right now, if you're a fan of Major League Baseball, but I grew up a huge Atlanta Braves fan just because I got to watch them on TBS every day. And in my opinion, one of the greatest managers of all time was Bobby Cox, who managed the Atlanta Braves. And the Atlanta Braves won, I think it was 14 straight division titles. And he used to tell the guys in the clubhouse, of course, they had greatest pitcher of all time, Greg Maddux. That's not an argument if you're interested in debating that. But Bobby Cox used to tell the team, don't get too high after a win, don't get too low after a loss. And I always thought that was fantastic for why they were so good for so long. And I think that's something that's huge to keep in mind with your own training. If you have a great day, don't get too high. If you want to post a video about it or something, that's fine, but don't post it like, oh, this is amazing. My strength is going to continue to go up 10 kilos a week. It's not. And if you have a down day, don't get too low. There's probably a reason for that. It was a day-to-day fluctuation. maybe you got a little less sleep that night before, maybe you incurred a little bit too much damage earlier in the week from training, maybe there were other family considerations going on that caused you to not do as well. So don't get too high, don't get too low. I think that's, this is, going on longer conversation from the Daily Max, but I think it's important with any style of training that you're doing. It's very difficult to do. It's very difficult to say. It's easy to say, hey, I'm not going to worry, but it's very difficult to actually do that. I understand, because training is important to all of us. But if you keep an even keel, it's going to be much better for that progress in the long run, and it's probably going to prevent or delay some of that staleness and boredom that we talked about.
Yeah, but talking about that, is it better to have a training partner or a coach? One interesting example is that most Russian powerlifters have coaches, while the Americans usually don't. And it seems that it's really hard to be a coach and an athlete in the same person. So I've been teasing out the Mike Zourdos about his ability to do that. I usually, I struggle with that, and I guess a lot of people struggle with that, just coaching themselves. I guess because of those emotional reasons, you need to have someone that has a more rational viewpoint and, clear head or cool head. So what do you think about that? How did you, solve those issues?
Yeah, I think that's a really, really good point. In terms of, doing daily max training for so long, certainly if I had a coach, I'm sure that coach wouldn't have had me do that. And they would have been much more objective than myself. And they would have, kind of kept me focused. And it gives you somebody to be accountable to. So I do think it's a really good thing to have in a lot of cases. You take somebody like Mike T. He has effectively coached himself. He's one of the few people that I think can do this, because I just think he's phenomenal, and I think it's just a great person. Mike and I have talked quite a bit. Somebody I'm very fortunate to have gotten to know, and I prod him sometimes. Hey, let me help you with this, and he prods me. Hey, let me help you with this. But it's a good relationship, because I think we've each been able to rub off on each other a little bit. And he's somebody I'll ask for insight into my training. I'll ask Matt Gary for insight into my own training, Ben Esgro for insight, Eric Helms for insight, Lane Norton for insight. I'll ask these people for a little bit of insight here and there, and then my students who have learned, Jordan Burke, who was a former national champion, guys like this, for insight, and they all ask me for insight, and we exchange. So I think if you don't have a coach necessarily that's writing a blog for you, it is good to have somebody to be accountable to, that you've at least asked for your feedback, because when it comes to yourself, you're often not as objective as you are with other people. I know personally I've spent a lot of time doing things myself that I've told other people not to do, which of course isn't a good trait to have. It's one of the flaws that I would have. So I'll try to run some of the things I write by some of my students and so forth. So I do think if you're at the highest level, it is good to have somebody to be accountable to. It doesn't mean that you're not a quote expert, or you're not knowing what you're doing, but it is good to have somebody that you can touch base with. So I know I'm very fortunate to have some of those other people that I can bounce ideas off of. They can critique what I'm doing, and vice versa. So I do think it's hugely beneficial. At the highest levels, one of the guys that I just respect the most is Matt Gary. I've had a few people contact me that are already enormously strong individuals, and I think I could help them with programming, but they're already doing really, really, really well. And I think the biggest thing they need is maybe a little technique help. And I don't know how much, optimal programming is going to be beneficial. And so, in my opinion, those individuals would be better with Matt Gary, because he's much more versed on the daily competition and really coaching people at the highest levels at a Worlds and working on technique. So at that point, I think he might be a better option for somebody. So I think also if you have a coach, and I know this is straying a little bit from your question, if you have a coach though, that communication style has to be something that each person is comfortable with. And I might think, hey, my programming strategies could be a little bit better for this person, but if our communication styles don't mesh, then they might be better off with somebody else. And I can think of an individual that I'm very, very close friends with that works with another close friend of mine now, that they're better than that person working with me because of their communication style. And I think that's fantastic to do. But also, as a coach, if you're there, I always like to quote my father, who would always say to me when I was young, in terms of communication, it's not what you say, it's how you say it. And if you do have a lifter, not everybody responds communication-wise the same way. You might be able to get the same point across to two people, but get it across in a different way, whereas you can be a little bit more direct with somebody, and somebody else, you can't be quite as direct, but you have to say it a little kinder, and it's okay to tell them something, but you have to do it in the right way. So I think all of those things need to be taken into account when coaching and when having a coach. But in short, the people at the highest levels of their sports have coaches. So a guy like Mike Zourdos, he does phenomenal, but if he asks, I just think the humility of a guy like that, he doesn't need to ask me questions. He doesn't need to have me, help out with RTS stuff, but he does. I mean, how cool is that a guy's been one of the best lifters of the last 10 years, will still ask for advice on stuff like that. So the people in the highest levels of their sports, whether it's team sports, whether it's individual sports, think of golfers, tennis players, they have coaches. So it doesn't mean that if you're at the highest level, you can't have somebody help you out. I just think it's logical to run ideas by somebody else. I remember 2 years ago, Ben Esgro, a great friend of mine who I mentioned, him and I took turns kind of writing blocks for each other. Doesn't mean we each didn't know what we were doing, but I trust him, he trusts me, and we can probably be more objective when looking at somebody else than looking at ourselves. Yeah, so I think it really speaks to the humility of a guy like Mike Zourdos, who's really at the highest levels, and he'll still ask for insight on things. Certainly, he does his own programming, but I think about a guy like that. He doesn't need my help. He's fantastic. A guy in bodybuilding I've been really fortunate to work with, Brian Whitaker. He doesn't need my help. He was a world champion before him and I were able to connect. He's going to be a world champion after we connect. But I think the guys at the highest level, they still ask for insight at some point. Which I think is really, really awesome. You take Susie Hartwig-Gary, with apologies to Mike T, my favorite lifter of all time. Her husband, Matt Gary, he does a lot of her programming. She could do it herself, but they still look for insight from people they trust. And I know I've done that with Eric Helms, Ben Esgro, those guys as well. Guys that are good friends of mine that I really trust also. And if you just look around at whether it's team sports or individual sports like golf, tennis, the guys at the highest level, they have coaches, man. Roger Federer, who's playing in the U.S. Open right now, and he's just phenomenal. Not that I'm a huge tennis fan, but I just love to watch athletes that are killing it. And that guy's in his mid-30s now, I guess, getting close, and he's doing great in the tournament right now. Tiger Woods, of course, is a shell of his former self. But he's always had somebody coach him, as well as these other guys at the top of golf right now. So, I see nothing wrong with. It doesn't mean that you don't know what you're doing if you've reached out to somebody else for help, especially if you have a network of people and some of the people I just talked about that you can talk and coincide with. A lot of times they can be more objective about you than you can be with themselves. And I don't necessarily fully leave my programming in somebody else's hands. I pretty much actually always do my own programming, so I probably have control issues with my own stuff, but it doesn't mean I'm immune from saying, hey, Matt Gary, can you take a look at this? Ben, can you take a look at this? Or my students, can you take a look at this? And is it really based upon everything that we've talked about and so forth, just to get another objective view at it? And I think that's done across the sports spectrum. So I certainly don't think there's any downside to doing that. Only good things can come from getting the opinion of somebody else that you trust, and then it's up to you if you take it or not. But having a coach will if you're an intermediate or lower level, certainly maybe be necessary in some respects if you don't have the insight. But if you are one of these individuals, having somebody to help you be accountable or to give you objective feedback is always a good thing. Just as if you need objective feedback on technique, I might say to Ben or to Matt Gary or somebody, hey, take a look at this, or to one of my students, take a look at this. There's nothing wrong with that, and that's done across any sport, and it probably should be done more in powerlifting.
Just finished a book called Organized Mind. It's actually a must read and very useful. I find a lot of interesting things that could be applied to training, and actually this question was basically motivated by that book. And one thing he mentioned inside is that when we plan something for ourselves, we are aware of all the nuances and all the insecurities and all the questions that comes inside the designing of the, in this case, training cycle or training program. But when we take from someone else, we are not aware of those, uncertainties of all those same things that bother us when we write it down. So when someone else gives us the training program, we are more likely to, stick to it compared to writing the program for ourselves, and then we just, then you are aware of all those things that comes inside the design, the decisions you made, and then you can just, okay, maybe I should change this, maybe I should change that, and then you end up not doing things or jumping bandwagons too quickly. Speaking of these emotional things, and I think that's usually neglected when it comes to training programming and training planning, the emotional side of things. And I wanted to touch base with you about this, especially when it comes to daily undulating programming. And I will say that how much is this variation inside the week a biological reality, and how much is a psychological thing? And one thing I've noticed is that the easiest thing to gain the results is to actually stick to a plan, is a consistency. And sometimes the training plan makes people bored, and they just need to change things, and they start and stop, so they lose consistency. And in my opinion, it's just, first of all, the first principle should be that training plan should provide consistency. Once you have that in place, you're kind of robust to gain any other benefits. But if you do a perfect program for 3 weeks and then you don't do it for a month, then there's no use. So my opinion, and I think Greg Knuckles touched on this as well, is that some people like variety, and some people strive on consistency. For example, if I do squats 3 times a week and on each day I do 3 sets of 5, some people might freak out if they hit, as you said, those highs and lows. So basically, I know if I hit like 180 kilos for 5 last time and today I'm not able to do it, I might freak out, and that might cause a emotional reaction to a training plan. While when you are changing parameters a bit, you're less likely to try to predict things. So you might accept it, or you might be actually not being aware of your performance. So if I'm doing sets of 10 and then next time I'm doing sets of 6, my brain might be less likely to make inferences to my performance, to my 1RM. For example, if endurance sports, I guess some coaches tend to switch the distances just to go over and under, not too much, because if you repeat the same distance, you're probably gonna get the same biological stimuli, but the emotional thing might be a little bit different, because you might start calculating. You might see, okay, something's happening, I'm stagnating. But if you go over and under distance, you might avoid this emotional reaction. So my question is that sometimes in those variations we do with the athletes, there might not be too much of a difference between our training programs when it comes to physiology or biology. There might be some difference when it comes to psychology and emotional things, and we usually disregard this, or we don't take it into account. So as you said, when you're talking to an individual, you need to be aware of his emotional or character. Does he likes variations? Does he like consistency? Is he a freak when it comes to measuring performance and things like that? So what are your opinions about emotional side of things, especially when it comes to undulating within the week?
I jotted a bunch of things down here, or typed a bunch of things down here. You were talking, so I don't forget. So I'll try to make it all flow as much as possible. But man, I could not agree more with everything that you just said. There are really a lot of facets to this. Now, the first thing that you had mentioned was how much the data seems to show that undulating the reps within a week is a good idea, but how much of that is physiological, or how much of that is mental? And the answer to that is I don't know. It's hard to say, and I don't know if the data is capable of giving an answer to that, which is going back to what I said earlier, which is, as researchers, we see things and we find things, and if you find something with consistency, and I do believe that has been found with consistency at this point, but exactly why, I have some theories on why neuromuscularly, but I do believe some of it is mental. I do believe some of it is staleness of doing the same number of repetitions over and over and not having any variation. So if somebody's going to thrive on a little bit more variation, then you need to give them that. And that even goes with exercise selection as well. I'm not the hugest fan of assistance movements, but certainly they do have a place at some point and we can utilize them. But if somebody wants assistance movements and that's going to keep them sane and that's going to keep them adhering to their training program, then I give them assistance movements. I know I mentioned his name previously, but Ben Asgrow had a great quote to me one time, and he said, "Are you doing this because you want to or because you think you have to?" And if you want to do something, you should do it. If you want to undulate the reps, if you want to utilize this lift, if I don't think it's necessary to do a pin squat in somebody's training cycle, I wouldn't program it in. But if somebody says, "Oh my God, I love pin squats, I'm going to be more motivated to do the rest of my session," then they should do pin squats, right? Put them in if somebody enjoys that variety. Personally, I don't care. I don't care about enjoying that. I enjoy doing the main lifts, so I focus on the main lifts, and I certainly think that's where the bulk of everybody's training should go. If you're looking for performance, we can't take it to the point where, we're only doing the main lifts 10% of the time. Now if you're not interested in performance, that's totally fine. But if you're interested in performance, you do maybe have to do some things you don't want to do, but you have to enjoy it. And that goes to the main concepts of any program, as you mentioned, are adherence. But adherence, progressive overload, and specificity. If you don't have all of the periodization models integrated appropriately and optimized, but you have adherence, you have overload, and you have specificity, you will be fine. You will make progress. It's similar to the dietary analysis we gave a little bit ago. Is if some people enjoy just only eating certain foods and never want to change from that, hey, that's their call. But if somebody can't be that rigid with their diet and mentally it's going to affect them and they're not going to stick to it, then it's not going to work. So everything we do needs to be based upon the concepts in the literature. But if there's other little things that people like to add in that still allows them to be based on the concepts, but allow them to enjoy it and allow them to adhere to training more, then they should absolutely utilize that. And that's where you have to get to know your individual. Here's what I like to say. Physiology is not different. So I for the most part at least, I get annoyed sometimes when people say, "Oh, this works for me," or "This doesn't work for me," and they're vastly different physiological strategies. No. You're not. You're not super special physiologically. However, mentally, things might work for you different than somebody else, and this gets into sports psychology, and that's not my area. So I don't want to speculate on things that aren't in my area. But if somebody can respond better mentally than somebody else to something, and that's going to improve their adherence to what is physiologically correct, then there's nothing wrong with doing that, and they should do that. So that goes to the staleness too of something like daily max training or small-off training if that's a huge jump in frequency for somebody. But you can't disregard psychology. You can't disregard the emotional side that you've talked about. People have to take that into account. So, is there an objective way to measure this? Is hard as well. I want to get back to kind of an objective way to measure things before training in just a second. But I also want to talk about all of this going into the bigger strategy of the emotional side of the importance of lifting in your life. If lifting is so important in your life, where you have a bad session and you go home at night and then you start yelling at your family at the kitchen table because somebody else took the biggest piece of chicken and you wanted that for dinner. Not Eric Helms, of course, because he's a baby man vegetarian, but if you ate like a normal person and somebody took the biggest piece of chicken and you started screaming at them, well, maybe you need to relax on the importance that lifting is in your life. So I think the emotional side of that, needs to be kept in check, and we need to understand, we need to program things so we can enjoy them, so we don't get too high, we don't get too low, and we understand that this is a hobby for most of us. So we can't disregard the emotional side. One way to look at this, there's a couple ways in the literature. One thing we did actually in our daily 1RM study is there's a scale called the PRS scale, or Perceived Recovery Status Scale, and it's a scale of 0 to 10, essentially 0 being you're the least recovered, you expect declined performance, and 10 being you feel recovered, you expect improved performance. And we gave this to our lifters every day before the onset of training in the Daily Max study, because we said, okay, this is going to be so fatiguing. If they can fill out this scale, we would expect that a perceived recovery status of 10 would correlate with improved performance, and a perceived recovery status of 0 would correlate with declined performance. However, we did not see that. It was not a consistent predictor of performance. So when we gauge somebody's, quote, readiness by this scale before the onset of training, it was not a consistent predictor of performance. The data was all over the place. So in something like that, how you feel isn't always necessarily what will happen in the subsequent training session. Is there a better way to gauge how you feel and predict performance? There probably is. But what we did, the way we did it, it didn't do that. So the point is, in sports psychology, there are probably other mental factors that I am not qualified to speak on that probably come into place that other questionnaires or so forth could answer before somebody going into training. So you can't disregard that emotional side, but we have to also understand it's difficult to gauge that effectively, difficult to gauge that objectively, but that's where autoregulation and RPE is so important. Man, I know I'm bouncing back and forth between a bunch of things, but I just have so much jotted down here. But that's where autoregulation and RPE is important too, with whatever strategy you have. If you need to back off and utilize a lower load that one day, if emotionally you're not quite there. But I think to your main point, which is over time, if you can adhere to training, and you allow yourself the flexibility to, let's say, it's undulate the reps, or to include a certain assistance exercise that you like, or maybe you need to go through a cycle where you're doing the main lifts simply less frequently. If it's far enough out from a competition where it's not going to negatively affect you, and you just simply don't want to make that commitment, that's great. That's fine. If anything, that's going to be better for your progress in the long run, because you're making the conscious decision now to make sure that you don't, to use a term, don't mentally overtrain, if you will, rather than physiologically overtrain. You don't mentally do that, so you're ready to go back into it in the long run. So how much of it is biological or mental, I can't say, but I think they both play a role in terms of undulating the reps, and you got to have something that you can adhere to. It could be the most optimal thing of all time on paper, but man, if you can't adhere to it, what's the point?
Yeah, exactly. I wanted to touch also a base regarding your recent paper on repeated boat effect, especially when it comes to team sports and in-season planning. As you said, we all did mistakes, and one of my mistake was that maybe I listened to a wrong advice, but for example, in season, we tend to, for example, we follow, let's say, a 10, 8, 6, 3, for example, over a week, and then we repeat the cycle. But what happens, and it goes back to your answer early in the interview, is that when we went back to doing 10 reps from a 3 reps phase, or whatever you want to call it, athletes got sore, and getting sore legs in season can get you fired. Can get you fired from work. The players might start complaining and everything, and the easiest way is to pinpoint a finger to a strength conditioning coach. So I guess repeated boat effect is very important concept, and by all means we want to avoid negatively affecting the performance of the players, especially in season for a team sports. And it comes back to the concept we mentioned earlier, to kind of infuse different reps schemes within a week, or don't spend too much time on a given rep range and then switch to another rep range, because that might cause fatigue or soreness. And as you said, instead maybe already do some of those variations within the week or within a training session. But also when it comes to rotating exercises, we want to be cautious, especially when you put a new exercise inside the training program, especially in season, it might cause soreness. One solution I had was to kind of let's say you are rotating the main exercises. So for example, before we switch the exercise, we introduce it a little bit earlier, using a lower intensity or lower volume. So when we switch to a new exercise, the athletes are already prepared. We all do this to avoid the soreness that comes with it. My question is, like, should we prevent this exercise variation and set and reps variation in season, or just stick to 3 to 5 reps and stick to a certain amount of exercises, or we need to purposely induce smaller variations, so we also avoid the repeated, we get the repeated boat effect and avoid the soreness.
So first, man, I'm still jotting down so many things. First, let me just say that this is, I think we've been on for 2 hours or so now, and I don't think we're running out of things to talk about. So this
exactly.
This is fantastic, my friend. I do appreciate this. So, okay, so let me try to touch on everything that you just mentioned here in terms of talking about the repeated bout effect a little bit. It's important in season. Its dependency on volume, intensity, frequency. Is it there when you change exercises? Should we be changing exercises in season? Where should intensity be in season? And then I want to come back to a term called flexible nonlinear periodization, which I think is important in season. So you referred at the outset to a recent paper on the repeated bout effect, which came out in print in the August issue of the Journal of Strength and Conditioning Research. And what we did in short there, for those that aren't familiar with that paper, is we just simply looked at, we've known for a long time the repeated bout effect is when you train and then you do your subsequent training bout, you will have an attenuated damage response. And the initial the initial bout that will attenuate damage for up to 6 months, meaning if you were trained today and then you didn't train at all up until 5.5 months later, you would still see less damage than the original bout. However, certainly the repeated bout effect is also time dependent, meaning if you trained 1 week after the original bout, you would have less damage than if you trained 5.5 months after the original bout. It's also volume dependent. So if you did if you had, somebody came in and was new to training and did 20 repetitions on an exercise today, they would have a ton of damage tomorrow. If somebody did 2 repetitions today and then 20 repetitions next week, the person that did 20 repetitions in the second week would still have damage, but would have less than the person who did it in the first week, because the 2 reps they did the first week did have some effect, what we call the protective effect, to reduce muscle damage a little bit. But of course, if you did 20 repetitions in week 1 and then 20 repetitions in week 2, that would be the best case to have the protective effect against damage. So what you were talking about, which is when you introduce a new exercise, you introduce it lightly, which is fantastic. And what I call that is, in addition to repeated bout effect, what the literature talked about is the protective effect against damage. So you're introducing it with the intention of trying to minimize damage when you really move into it and you do more intensity and you do more volume. So that's the protective effect. And the data shows that if you utilize as little as 10% of 1RM in the initial bout, you will get a protective effect against damage, and it will be lower in the subsequent bout of that exercise than if you didn't do the initial 10% bout. Now, obviously, if you do 20% of 1RM in the initial bout, the damage response will be even lower in the subsequent bout, 30% even lower, and so forth. What we showed in our recent study, I published a study using solely bicep curls. So, for all you bodybuilders out there, I am familiar with the biceps, maybe not personally, but in the literature. So what we did here was we were the first to show that the repeated bout effect does still occur when you switch exercises that are muscle specific. So we had 2 groups, and they were unaccustomed to exercise for resistance training for 6 months prior. And one group did incline curls in week 1, and then we tested indirect measures of damage the rest of the week. And then they came in week 2, they did incline curls again, and we tested damage. And we saw that in week 2 they had less damage, which is the repeated bout effect. When you repeat a bout of exercise, you get an effect of less damage. The other group did incline curls the first week, and then the second week they did preacher curls. So we did the same muscle group. The exercise was, quote, muscle specific, but we varied the exercise. And what we saw was that the repeated bout effect still occurred. Now, we can really only extrapolate these results to this muscle group or smaller muscle groups. Would the repeated bout effect occur to the same magnitude if we changed between, squats and front squats, or bench and incline bench, or something like that? That I can't speak to. I think the repeated bout effect would still occur. I don't know if damage would be all the way back down to baseline. So I do think that what you do is a good thing in that you introduce an exercise lightly so that you can get the protective effect before you go to it. And in team sports, that is so important in training, because you have to minimize damage in the weight room, if you will, because the most important thing they do is practice on the field. I always kid with my class. I say, we talk about specificity being the overriding principle and progressive overload. I say, what's the best way for a soccer player to get better at playing soccer? And of course it's playing soccer, but after they say playing soccer, I always say it's squatting, what's wrong with you? But of course it's playing soccer. So you have to minimize damage in the weight room so when they go to the field, it doesn't compromise their performance. But this is why coaching or training for powerlifting is so much easier than for a team sport like soccer, because you don't necessarily, as a strength coach, have control over what the athletes are doing on the field in practice or how many minutes they're playing in a match. So you have to take all of those things into account and not have them too fatigued so they can practice and play, but still get the physiological adaptations you want so they can still enhance their performance. And if you don't get the balance of that, as you said, you would lose your job. I was a strength coach at a collegiate level before I continued on to do a PhD, so I'm somewhat familiar with this concept. So it is important to take all those factors into consideration, to try to understand what the volume of training is going to be at practice on the field or on the court for whatever sport you are, and then to structure your training throughout the week to prepare for that, to do higher volume days when it's appropriate and lower volume days when it's appropriate. And that brings me back to the term of flexible nonlinear periodization, which we mentioned. In a flexible model, originally published 2010 by McNamara and Stern, and then Ryan Calhoun, who just finished his master's at University of South Florida under Bill Campbell, just did a study that's not out yet on flexible daily undulating periodization, in which you would essentially choose whether you're doing the hypertrophy strength or power day or the high volume day or the lower volume day when you go into the gym that day. It's not fixed. And for team sports in season, this is huge because you can vary the volume you're doing in the weight room depending on what the athletes did in practice the day before, if they have a match that week, if it's, let's say, if it's a collegiate level here in the United States, if it's a freshman that's not playing as much as opposed to a senior that's playing more, you can manipulate their volume and intensity based upon that. You can introduce new exercises, as you talked about, that might create more damage when they have a lower volume practice week. So that way you can go ahead and adapt to it. So when you do the newer volume exercise when they have a game or a match or a higher volume practice, then you don't have as much damage. So I think a flexible nonlinear model is almost paramount importance during the season. So you can deal with all of those things to make sure you're training appropriately and not overstressing or understressing, stressing depending on what training volume is in practice, and making sure the athletes are prepared appropriately. So and all of those things can be manipulated to make sure you're abiding by in eliciting the repeated bout effect. And of course, the repeated bout effect is a good thing. If you are able to induce the repeated bout effect, that means that you can handle more training, you can adhere to training, you can do more frequency, and if you can do more frequency, you can do more volume over time, which is going to lead in greater adaptation. So the fact that the repeated bout effect still manifests itself when you change exercises to a certain degree is certainly a good thing in the long run. As you know, damage isn't the end-all be-all for muscle growth if we're getting back to more strength sports now. But in season in a team sport, I think flexible nonlinear periodization is something that can and should be utilized, and it's going to be utilized where you're using a higher volume day. It doesn't mean that all athletes on that team are doing higher volume days on Monday. Maybe if there was a match on Sunday, the individuals that played more minutes are doing lower volume than the individuals that played less minutes, and so forth. So we have to take all of those things into account, and that's why working with an individual team is so much more difficult than working with a strength sport athlete, because you have so many things to take into consideration, and you also have a lot less control over what they're doing on the field. This goes into the concept of RPE with team sports. If I want to program for a powerlifter, and I know from my experience that I want to do 5 sets of 8 with him a day, and it's in a volume block, so I want to keep my RPEs at 8 or lower, and I know from his past cycle that he can do repeated 8s and always stay between a 6 and an 8 RPE at 70%, that's good. But if I want to program for a football team here in the United States, and I want everybody's RPE to be between 6 and 8, I can't say everybody should do 5 sets of 8 at 70%. Some people, maybe the cornerbacks, are going to record 5 RPEs on all of the sets, but maybe the linemen, 5 sets of 8 at 70%, they recorded 10 RPE on the first set. Well, now we've overshot our RPE. They've created too much damage, and now we're going to have to drop the load for the subsequent sets, and it might not equal the volume that we want. So I'm going to want to utilize probably an RPE system with those athletes, but the downside of an RPE system with those athletes to make sure everybody's in the appropriately stressing during the volume block is you don't know if they're good with RPE. They might be recording RPEs of 9, but it might be it might actually be a 10. So the point is there's so much more to take into consideration with team sport athletes when utilizing this and programming this, and really you have to have all of these tools at your disposal. And everything is based upon the concepts that we find in the scientific literature, but there's certain tools you have to use for certain athletes and certain teams that you're not going to use for other individuals in this team setting. So your job, my friend, is a lot harder than my job, I think, and the things that you have to consider for individual teams.
Yeah, but it involves less details. So it's different. I don't know if it's harder or easier. You just when it comes to squatting, coaching for a powerlifter involves a lot of much more details, and you need to go much deeper down the rabbit hole compared to average athlete. But again, there are other things that you need to take into account. One of the solutions I kind of implemented over the years is that we don't prescribe exact number of reps and percentage of 1 RM. We give some wiggle room. For example, you might prescribe 3 sets at 75% for 5 to 8 reps, and then if the player is feeling really good, he can push a little bit. And if he's feeling if he's having a down day, he can go for 5 or things like that. You can prescribe different intensity bracket in terms of 1 RM. So you can say, okay, 75 to 80% for 3 sets of 5 or things like that, just to give some a little bit of wiggle room, especially with the athletes that are not familiar with the RPE scale. Also, it comes back to how much decision making you want to give to the team, to individual players. Some of the players have more accountability, and you can give them more freedom to decide what to do on a given day. And for some, you just need to be on top of them. So you just need to be there, and this is what you're doing, man. And don't give them too much wiggle room, because it's gonna get messy. One thing that it's up and coming recently is velocity based training, and using a velocity as a feedback. And this actually goes really nicely to my next question, is that in some of your or most of your studies you tracked velocity of the lifts. And what's your opinion about this, in quotation marks, novel approach of using velocity in monitoring training or even prescribing training?
Yeah, I think it can be fantastic. Based upon what you just said, and I'll turn this into the velocity conversation in a second. Whereas if you give your athletes, in your team sports a range, you said we're going to do a certain amount of sets at between 5 and 8 reps, and athletes can push a little more, so forth. I think that's fantastic. What I might do is have a range. I might set a volume magnitude or a volume goal for the day, and they need to hit within that rep range that's maybe even between 4 and 8. It's pretty large with 75%. But each time they're going to stop at the 8 RPE, and they're going to do as many sets as they need to at the 8 RPE, so each set has the appropriate physiological strain, but it's not creating too much damage. They're not going too close to failure. Some athletes might do more sets and then the other to get to the same relative volume if you set that volume threshold for them. And it's perfect you talked about velocity, because one thing I'd written down was, we can utilize velocity to dictate that. What we did, as you mentioned in our RPE papers, at certain intensities, we measured RPE, but we also measured velocity to kind of correlate or go along with that RPE. And we found that different velocities were appropriate for different populations. But if one way to validate in a team sports setting, if you have access to a velocity calculator, a Tendo unit, a GymAware, whatever it might be, you can use that velocity to get more of an objective RPE, because the RPE scale is objective, but it's also gauged subjectively by the individual, whereas velocity is objective. Now, it has its limitations because if somebody has a breakdown in technique, it might record a slower velocity than they actually could have done. But for the most part, velocity is objective. So if somebody records it, let's say a 9 RPE, or let's say they record they go at 90%. Well, at 90%, that's going to be 90% of 1 RM. That's going to be in an experienced lifter. Our data shows a little over 0.3 meters per second, and maybe around an RPE of 8 or 8.5. So in that case, we can use that velocity, and we can use the data to kind of dictate about where their RPE should be, and we can match up what that lifter says or that athlete says their RPE are with the velocity and with the data to see if they're utilizing it appropriately. Now, of course, that has its limitations as well, because certain leverages are going to yield different RPEs, whereas we have longer limb lengths as opposed to shorter limb lengths. But we can use all of that data appropriately to kind of validate somebody's RPE, and then velocity will be individualized a little bit to the individual's training status and to the individual's leverages. But once we get enough data on a certain individual, we know at about when they hit an 8 RPE, their velocity is going to be, let's say, 0.33 meters per second or somewhere around there. So when it's about 0.33 meters per second, then we can have them train in a velocity-based system if we so choose, and we know where their RPE is going to be about. That way we can do it very, very objectively. But you have to create enough data on that individual first, based upon their leverages and their training experience, to know what velocity for them is going to correlate with what RPE. And I think in a practical setting, most people don't have access to something like a Tendo that's very expensive. So this is where the RPE scale that we put into our recent paper is helpful. And what we did with it, if somebody takes a look at the paper, is, the closer you are to 1 RM, the more you can accurately gauge an RPE. An experienced lifter can say, finish a set and give a 9 RPE, which means 1 repetition in reserve, and that's going to be pretty accurate for the experienced lifter, maybe not for the novice lifter. But traditionally RPE scales just measure effort, light effort, little effort, medium effort, heavy effort, and so forth. If you look at our scale from 4 and down, our scale actually measures effort. So what we've done is we've combined RPE and repetitions in reserve into the same scale. So if somebody doesn't have access to objectively measuring velocity, what we can say is on the RPE scale, you want to stay below 5. And on our scale, below 5 means it's light effort, and you can't effectively quantify exactly how many reps you have in reserve. So if you're trying to do explosive or power training one day, and you just want that day to be solely explosive, then you want to stay on the scale below 5. Meaning, if you can begin to effectively exactly quantify how many reps you have in reserve, and you want to be as explosive as possible as a team sport and do power training, then that means you've probably gone too heavy. So if you're training alone or you're training without the use of velocity, I think the scale, if you look at our paper, helps with some of that in that sense as well. So certainly the farther you get away from 1 RM, the more difficult it is. But I think velocity-based training is fantastic. I think our paper gives a certain basis from where velocity should be in trained and untrained individuals, but it does have its limitations, as every study does, because we also have to understand that leverages are going to affect things, and you might get a really experienced lifter, but they have really, really long femurs and long limbs, so their velocities compared to somebody that's experienced and has little short baby man limbs like myself is going to be faster at the same intensity if they have the longer limbs than the shorter individual. So you have to be able to correlate the RPEs that they give with their individual velocity, and then create, let's say, their volume block based upon velocity, and that velocity for a taller person at an 8 RPE might be 0.37 meters per second, whereas for myself it might be 0.30 meters per second. But I think velocity-based training is fantastic as long as we are able to kind of individualize it and know that training status and leverages are going to affect the correlation between various velocities and various RPEs.
Yeah, just a selfish plug. I developed a couple of converters or calculators where you can actually, develop your own velocity profile and use that to convert from a traditional percentage base to velocity base approach, and it's available on the blog somewhere or in the download section. Anyway, I think it's it's a great tool, and I think we're still learning how to use it, to be honest. And I guess recently the amount of data and amount of information is increasing at a faster rate than our ability to use it. And the time will tell how much of the big data we are collecting now is going to be useful. So the new approaches should be more concerned about making things more actionable and understandable for the coaches, and not just create fancy charts for the board and weekly reports. And I guess velocity-based training with the novel devices that are easier to carry around and collect, they might yield some benefits when it comes to individualizing training. Anyway, I want to finish up with my questions at this point, and I'll just gonna go to questions from a Facebook wall. I'm gonna skip some of them because I think we already answered them in the interview. And Mike, try to be short with these. And if you already mentioned it and answered some of the questions, just saying, okay, we already answered those. And I guess some of those questions are from your friends just making fun of you. So I'll read them anyway. Yeah. So the first question is from Sergio Navadio. Let me just quickly find he posted 6 questions. And I think that question number 3 is interesting. When choosing, for example, a daily undulating model for powerlifting or strength power hypertrophy, for powerlifting of strength power hypertrophy instead of high reps, medium reps, low reps, is the power day in your first model just a way to get more volume in and do a light day, or is there really a notable training effect from moving the bar fast that will transfer to a max strength?
Fantastic question. We covered this a little bit, and this is when we, changing the reps and changing the phases, we start to distinguish between daily undulating periodization and daily undulating programming. And in our recent study that just came out, which was the publication version of my dissertation, we utilized a daily undulating periodization, although we did state in the practical applications and discussions of that paper something to the effect of, even though DUP provides a setup for success, it's more likely that this should fit into the yearly structure of a linear macro cycle and block periodization model. And I'm very proud of that, because we are really the first in the literature. There's a really good review paper from a few years ago, but in some of the original research, to really discuss integrating periodization models. But to his point of having, let's say, a light power day of singles at 80% for explosiveness or something, is there really effect of that? And I'm not sure. I don't think there's a great effect. The way I utilize that mostly nowadays is, if somebody is currently training once or twice a week and I want to move them into 3 times a week, to not increase volume too much too soon, a quote power day doing singles at 80%, as Sergio points out, is a very easy way to slightly add a day of frequency without stressing the lifter too much too soon and increasing volume too much too soon. And I might do one mesocycle with 2 heavier days undulating between, let's say, 8 reps and 4 reps, and then a power day in the middle of the week with a lower amount of reps, just singles at 80%. And that's a very easy way to increase frequency. Then in the next block, we can go to a more standard 8-6-4 type of undulation pattern. So it's a very, very easy way to do that as we move forward. The other way, and the other reason I like that type of setup sometimes is, we always have kind of the conundrum of if we're going to train squat with a higher frequency, what are we doing with the deadlift? Well, if we have we can train the deadlift after the squat for sure, and I do a lot of that. But if somebody needs to work on their deadlift to bring that out, let's say somebody's squatting 3 times a week, Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, well, that Wednesday I'll make that power day that Sergio was talking about, and it singles at 80%, almost serves as a warm-up, and then that day will be the deadlift-centric, deadlift-focused day, and then the lighter deadlift days will be after the squat. So if we use that daily undulating periodization model rather than the programming model, it allows us to bring the deadlift out to the forefront of that day as well. So it just depends upon where you are in the yearly linear macro cycle. I think having that power day is a very easy way to increase frequency, to not stress somebody too much too soon. It's not something I use a ton, but it's a very good way to progress somebody from a frequency of twice a week to 3 times a week to 4 times a week before you get into the programming strategy. And then it's something that you can utilize if you want to bring the deadlift out front one day to keep a squat frequency, but one day have a little lighter squat so you can focus on the deadlift.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. And I guess, as you said, it comes back to the difference between daily undulating periodization and daily undulating planning. And it comes also back to the way we classify things, or the way we classify the characteristics or biomotor qualities. And if you're really hitting that quality, or you're actually just providing a variety. So again, we need to see the big picture instead of just saying, okay, today I'm doing power. And as you said, we need to see how that fits in a bigger scale, and the bigger objectives of the cycle or the training plan.
Absolutely. The one thing real quick is people don't need to be so confined by definitions. The what I like to call, I don't even know if this is a real thing. I definitely made this up, but what I like to call the training establishment has given us these definitions for years and years of things, and it doesn't mean they're true. So we don't need to be confined to this type of periodization, this type of periodization. We should integrate them. They do exist to an extent, but we need to understand the bigger scale and where it all fits, as you just said.
Yeah, I call that a root problem. So the problem that, speaking a little bit philosophical, speaking about ontology, the what exists outside, we just use different classifications, and then we try to use those classifications, in programming. So, the way we classify things affects everything, going further. So, for example, we know that females are much better in recognizing colors. So they have like 200 names for different colors, and we just the males just recognize like red, blue, yellow, and that sort of things. And when they go with the I don't know, I can't even pronounce those terms for the colors, like coral, things like that. So they just have the more precise classification compared to us. This is just a funny plug. It's nothing to be serious, or just when it comes to differences between males and females. But that's just one thing to point out when it comes to classifying things to start with. And then for example, if we classify strength qualities using 6 categories, and then we are wondering, okay, I'm hitting 5 of those, am I doing concurrent training or am I doing something else? So it comes back to the way we classify things, and as you said, it just creates confusion because we try to use those classifications in a training program.
Yeah, absolutely.
So another question from Sergio, and I think this comes back to flexible non-linear periodization you mentioned, is that what do you think about relying on biofeedback like omega wave for daily undulating periodization instead of plant-based on 1RM and RP or bar speed? So he said, I feel I'm good at listening to my own body, but for young people, maybe bar speed or heart rate variability might be a better choice. What's your take on this?
Yeah, so I'm just jotting a few things down here so I don't forget. So I think listening to biofeedback is fantastic. We have to realize though that it's not always the end all be all. So I think there's sometimes something to be said for, hey, you just got to go put the work in. But to his point, I think it's a great way. McNamara and Stern study from 2010 showed a flexible nonlinear model was superior to more rigid nonlinear model where the training order was fixed within a week. A Ryan Calhoun study out of USF did not show a difference between flexible daily undulating periodization and daily undulating periodization model that had the fixed order within the week. But I have some ideas on why there might not have been a difference. If you look at our study we just published, which has come from my dissertation, our goal was, it's not a flexible model, but our goal was to allow for maximum recovery. So it was based upon the assumption that this model would provide more recovery than this model, which would yield more volume. And we did see that for the most part, that it allowed for more volume because we set it up in a way that we were predicting these individuals would have more recovery and they would be ready to go. So you can use, there's a few things here you can utilize. First of all, heart rate variability I think is fantastic. It's not something that I'm hugely versed in. Some of you guys might know Mike T. Nelson. I would recommend looking him up. He's done a lot of stuff with heart rate variability, much more versed in it than I am. A good friend, somebody I learned a lot from. My buddy Marcos of mine, who I did doctoral work with, has done some stuff with heart rate variability. But those guys can probably speak to that better than I can. But like in our daily 1RM study, I said we used the perceived recovery status scale. That was not a consistent predictor of performance. Also, we but on the last warm-up every day in the daily 1RM study was at 85% of the day 1RM. And we measured RPE and velocity. And what we found was that we predicted that the higher velocity at 85%, the faster velocity would yield better 1RM performance each day. That was actually not a very consistent predictor of performance. What was a consistent predictor was RPE. And all of the individuals we looked at, RPE at 85% was the lower the RPE, the higher the 1RM tended to be that day. So actually RPE, the perceptual response, was a better feedback, but the perceptual response was not a better feedback before training, only after the onset of training. So in a way that might make sense is, how many times I would challenge somebody to think of how many times they would felt sore, they had some sort of soreness left over from a previous session. Then they went into train, blood flow began to increase, and they didn't feel sore anymore, and that went away. So it's probably a little bit more appropriate to gauge, if you're using a flexible model, to choose which session you're going to do actually after the onset of the warm-up based upon the data that we have. Because once you get into the session, sometimes you say, I feel terrible before I start training, but then you begin to train and you feel a little bit better. So it's probably once you get into your warm-up, if you have a standardized warm-up, gauge RPE, gauge velocity during it, and then once you begin the actual working sets, you might want to then utilize, if you do a high volume day or low volume day, or what you're doing with the flexible model. So I think Sergio has a great point, and I think those tools should be utilized. I don't think they're the end-all be-all, but it is a component of what we should do. It's just a question of finding out what is going to be the best predictor and what's not going to be the best predictor. I would suggest that you're going to be able to more accurately predict what you're going to do actually after the onset of the start of the warm-up rather than beforehand. But again, we still have limited data on that as well.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Couple more questions by Sergio. Is there a way of keeping a bench press strength when you're on a diet? I don't know if this is your area of specialty, but I'll just make sure to ask it.
It's not my area of specialty, so I don't want to speculate too much. I mean, the short answer is yeah, absolutely. I'm sure there is. Now, if you're dieting and you're losing body mass, you're losing body weight, certainly that's going to obviously be much more difficult than if you're in a caloric surplus and you're like me and you're eating whatever you want all the time, and you're not worried about that. So certainly it's going to make things more difficult. I think that's just more logical. But I guess the one thing I would extrapolate this into a bigger question is if you're, let's say, a bodybuilder, or you're somebody that's on a diet, if you will, or caloric restriction, and you're looking to decrease body mass, decrease body fat. I think auto-regulation is an important tool to utilize here, because if you have a 1RM that is 200 kilos and you're 10 weeks into a diet and you're trying to progress everything, increasing an arbitrary amount of weight each week or increasing percentages each week, well, there's probably going to come to a certain point where your diet's going to catch up with you and you're not going to be able to maintain that. So if, let's say, you're a bodybuilder going into a show, you have to be able to utilize auto-regulation at a certain point, because inevitably you're going to lose strength. Now, it also depends on how much body mass you're losing. I mean, if you already are at 5% body fat and you're going on a diet and you're decreasing body mass, it's going to be much more difficult. But if you're at if you're a male and you're at 25% body fat and you're gradually losing body fat on a diet, you're probably going to be able to maintain strength or get stronger a little bit more. So if, let's say, you're a powerlifter now, switching gears, cutting the last kilo or two before a competition, well, if you keep your intensity high, just as you would for an in-season team sport athlete, you can probably take advantage of some neural factors and some skill adaptation to maintain or increase strength while you're cutting that last kilo or two before competition. So yeah, certainly. I mean, the very, very basic answer is if you're going to be on a diet, it's going to be more difficult in caloric restriction than it's going to be in a caloric surplus. And if you're a bodybuilder, utilizing auto-regulation can help mitigate missed reps as you're going in later into prep. Also, unrelated, I know this wasn't the intent of the question, but getting into powerlifting, and one of the biggest things that I almost cringe when I see is in novice or intermediate lifters in powerlifting that make a huge deal out of cutting weight before a competition. this is not a good strategy. There are very few times where I would really recommend cutting weight before a competition. If you're 5 kilos over, 11 pounds or so over, and you're a week out, and you're just an intermediate lifter, and you just want to win your weight class at some local meet, well, don't cut weight for that. Inevitably, you're going to lose strength. Your lifts are going to be down. You might only end up making 5 lifts out of the 9. Worse, you might bomb out of the meet. Also, you've planned your attempts, if you're using appropriate attempt selection, on what you were doing, and what you were doing for your strength, you were 11 kilos heavier. So now your opener, instead of being at 90% of your 1RM, might now be at 97%. So why are you cutting weight unless it is to win a national championship, to qualify for a national championship, to win a world championship, if you're in the United States, to maybe get into the Arnold Classic, or something like that. Now, if you're only 2 kilos over and you're a month out and you can easily make that weight class, sure, go for it. But too often we see people that are at the novice or the intermediate level stressing to cut weight. Just go have fun. Go take care of it. So I know that wasn't the initial intent of the question, but I try to take care of that first and then get into this. But some of the more specific factors of macronutrients, not my area. So Ben Edgar, Eric Helms, Lane Norton, give them a call.
Yeah, thanks for expanding on that. The next question by Sergio is that are accessory single joint exercises a waste of time for powerlifting if you can just do more volume on the main lifts?
I think it's a good question. I think it goes to a lot of what we've been talking about today, which is that in the most inherent sense, will these single joint exercises, whether it's tricep pushdowns or tricep extensions or bicep curls or things like this, will they have a direct transfer to 1RM on the main lifts? No, I just don't see it. And if they do, it's very, very minimal. It's going to be negligible. Certainly other multi-joint lifts, whether it's military presses, pin squats or some sort of specific multi-joint lift, will have a much greater transfer to the main lift. So I don't see them having a direct effect. However, the advantage of that too is they're probably not going to be too taxing. So if you want to utilize them for aesthetic purposes or you just simply enjoy them, then you should do them. I don't do bicep curls, but I don't really care about that. Of course, unless I'm going to go to the beach, and then I keep the dumbbells in my car so I can pump up in the parking lot. But we all know how that goes. So by the way, I live in South Florida, so they do measure your biceps when you're about to walk onto the beach. So I got to get ready. But I don't think they have an inherent transfer, and it's negligible if it is there. But that doesn't mean. So I don't necessarily program them for people unless they're requested. If somebody wants them because they enjoy them, or they have a dual strength and aesthetic type of purpose, obviously for aesthetic purposes they have a much bigger place. But if somebody enjoys them and it's going to make them want to go to the gym more and do the main lifts, then go ahead and do the single joint exercises. Now, don't do them to the point whereas if you're doing 5 sets of 20 on a leg curl, and that's going to create a ton of hamstring damage, and that's going to inhibit the volume you're going to do on the main lift. So I wouldn't do something that's going to negatively affect the main lifts. But if you like to add them in appropriately in your program where they're not going to affect the main lifts and you just enjoy doing them, then go for it. There's absolutely nothing wrong with that.
Yeah, thanks for that. I think Sergio shared a couple of good questions. Let's continue with a couple of more questions. Eddie Alvarez asked what the taper is.
So as soon as you brought up the name, I immediately just pretty much disregarded anything that he said. I don't see a need to entertain this certain individual's question. This is an individual I have to see almost on a daily basis. So now the fact that I'm having to deal with his name in my head, even when I'm at home, brings me great strife. I understand his question. Eddie misunderstands that it's joke time. And, it's 11:47 a.m. here on the East Coast right now. It's not joke time, so he just thinks he can say whatever he wants. But to give a serious answer to a question about what a taper is, even though I know that is not what he is looking for. So to give a serious answer to a question about what a taper is, the principles of a taper are that you decrease volume and you maintain intensity and you maintain frequency. However, I would like to state here what I state to my students, which is tapering is a science, but it's not an exact science. So tapering depends on what you were doing in your block. So if you're in a volume block, the intensity that you do in a taper is going to be relative to the intensity you do in a volume block. So let's say you're training 3 days a week on a lift in a volume block and you're training at 70, 75, and 80%. Then during my taper, my average intensity would probably be around 75% because that was my average intensity during the volume block. During an intensity block, if I'm training at 80, 85, and 90%, if I'm training 3 days a week, then my average intensity would be around 85%. Most of the data in the literature, although there's a little bit newer data that's coming out on resistance training, but most of the older data is on endurance training. So we have to extrapolate what's going on from endurance training into resistance training. So if somebody is training 3 times a week in a volume block, I might have them to keep my average intensity, around 75%. I might have them drop the volume and do some low reps at 70% on Monday, and then do some single repetitions at 80% on Wednesday, so my average intensity is 75%, and then have them test at the end of the week on Friday if they were training Monday, Wednesday, Friday. What I've now done is kept my frequency to 3 times, with one day being a test day, and I have now had my average intensity in my taper, what my average intensity was during the volume block. However, let's say on my 80% taper day I did 3 sets of 1. Do I know for a fact that 3 sets of 1 at 80% was better than doing 2 sets of 1 at 82.5%? To be honest, I have no idea. All I know is that it's conceptually based upon the principles in the literature. So, that's where we get into the trouble. People start stating things as magic. And when people start stating things as magic, as they say, no, this guy gave you 3 sets of 1 at 80% for your taper, you need to do 3 sets of 1 at 82.5%. These are the people that you probably shouldn't listen to because they're trying to state things in absolutes rather than stating things conceptually. And so with a taper, decrease volume, maintain intensity, and maintain frequency. Also, the length of the taper should be dependent upon the length that you trained without taking a taper. So if you train for 6 months with no taper, then you should probably start tapering a few weeks or more in advance of your competition to gradually decrease the volume. If you've only trained for 4 weeks, then you just really need a 1-week taper, or you probably need not as much of a reduction in volume as you get closer to that competition. So it's a science, but it's not an exact science. I talked about Eddie's question being joke time, but what he's referring to is, when you're doing something like daily 1RM training, this is where the principles still apply. So if you're doing daily 1RM training, where you're, not necessarily daily 1RM, but high frequency, and you're training a lift every single day, does that mean that you should train a lift every single day during the taper? Yes, it does. Now, what you need to do is drop the volume. So if you're maxing every single day and doing 5, 6, 7 sets of volume, well, what you would do is you would gradually do that taper, meaning after you finish the cycle during the last week, you might max, and instead of doing 5 sets of volume, you might do 2 or 3 for a day. And then after that, you might max and do 1 set of volume. And then after that, you might max and do no volume. And then you might just do a single at 85%, and then you might test after that. So the taper is dependent upon what you did in the block, and the key points are to drop volume, to maintain intensity, and to maintain frequency. It's a science, but it's not an exact science.
Thanks for sharing that. Derek Evely, who's a throwing coach from Canada, asked a very interesting question, and that's something that I'm trying to wrap my head around. And he's asking, do you think it's possible to develop absolute strength abilities without using the highest intensity zone loads in training? And if so, what are your recommendations for achieving this?
So I think it's possible to an extent to not, let's say, go above 90% and build strength. I think the bulk of your training, even in an intensity block, is probably going to be done between 80 and 90%, and the bulk of your training over the course of the year is probably going to be done between 70 and 85% or something like that. So again, those aren't exact numbers, but I think that is a pretty good estimation for the most part.
Yeah, I think, sorry to interrupt, I think Derek is coming from a specific context. I think he's using a Bondarchuk approach to training. So he's training throwers, hammer throwers, and what they're doing is they are basically throwing every day. Sometimes twice a day they've been throwing, and the way they do a strength training is they also train high frequency training. So they're basically throwing and lifting daily, sometimes twice a day. And I think he noticed that he really decreased the intensity of the lifts, maybe up like 60%, 60 to 70% for doubles or triples. And I guess he's asking is that when it comes to that high of a frequency of lifting and throwing, just increasing intensity might be taxing too much taxing the athlete, and he can't be doing heavy throwing. So in this case, the goal of increasing the max absolute strength might be of a second priority. So the goal is is increasing the strength, but also avoiding negatively affecting the throwing frequency or throwing performance.
Absolutely. Okay. Thank you for the clarification. So to his point, I mean, he's exactly right, whereas, of course, specificity is going to be the most important thing for these individuals. If their goal is to throw, then they need to throw. That's paramount. Now, when he's doing doubles, triples, let's say around 60%, I also think that's good for this population, because that's what I call sport-specific power, or team sport-specific power. So, the reason I don't recommend something like doubles, triples for speed, if you will, in a powerlifter is, it will be very explosive and it will increase power output, but it won't transfer to the heavier loads. This will transfer in these sports just as it would in something like basketball or volleyball or something like that. So it's much more efficacy in that sense. However, I do think that they will but it would be beneficial to train at a higher percentage of 1RM at some point. Not all the time, and obviously if they're throwing every day, if they're training at a 1RM or close to it or over 90%, that's going to fatigue them and affect them for throwing. But if you never do it, they'll also never adapt to it, and it will be more difficult to increase that max strength, also to hit on higher threshold motor unit recruitment as they're going to that heavier strength. So what I would utilize is more of a flexible model in that case. And as we talked about, kind of like in season, if we have a time where they're backing off a little bit on a day on the intensity of their throwing, and I'm certainly not familiar with throwing practice if they have higher volume days or throwing or lower volume days. But if they have a day that's lower volume, that's where I might work in the higher intensities of 1RM, but also you can keep the volume lower. These individuals, if they're doing, let's say, over 90%, it doesn't mean that they have to be doing higher volume to create damage in the gym. They can be going in the weights and doing that just for the neuromuscular adaptations, and then going out and throwing. And if they're doing something that is very low volume in singles at 90%, that will help them, but it also won't tax them that much. So I think they can utilize that, but it just should be a lower volume strategy and used appropriately. But I do like the power or explosive strategy with the doubles and triples at 60% as well for those athletes. The other question is, can you elicit some sort of PAP or post-activation potentiation effect with training an explosive movement of the same muscle group at, let's say, 90% for singles before they go out and throw that day, as we've seen in, let's say, sprinters or jumpers, where I think that's possible as well. So that's more of an acute warm-up strategy. So I think there's place for all of that. It just needs to be appropriate and maybe use a flexible model to program it.
Yeah, that makes sense. And it also brings up the importance of context when analyzing training program, or actually just lifting program. If we take it out of context, we might say, oh, what the hell is this guy doing? Like two reps at 60%. So we don't see the big picture and the high frequency of actually lifting and throwing. So I guess that makes sense. And it comes back to this idea of alternating periods where you actually might emphasize a volume or emphasize the frequency or intensity of training. And again, if one of the concepts of Bondarchuk method is that if you keep changing things too frequently, or changing a lot of things at the same time, you never know what's actually bringing the benefits. And he's actually using complex approach where he's training numerous things at the same time, but he keeps them stable for a while, and then he's judging the effects and using that feedback to adjust and eventually come up with a very individualized training. So again, this is this type of problem when it comes to Derek Evely's question. We also have one funny question again from I guess from a friend of yours, Mike Taylor. Do you guess the question he is asking?
He's probably looking for a definition or some sort of clarification on what it means to be a baby man.
Exactly.
So do you have the exact question?
Yeah, he said like ask him what a baby man is.
Oh man, Mike Taylor, what a great guy. Mike Taylor going on starting physical therapy school here soon, I believe through the Air Force. And let me just not to talk about too many people individually, but I want to talk about a guy like Mike Taylor. This guy is evidence of just work ethic and progression and consistency and just a tremendous attitude. When I was at Florida State University, that's where I did my PhD work, and we started. When I was there, along with Jordan Burke, Stephen Ferraresi, Caleb Baszler, guys like that, we started a weightlifting club there, which became a powerlifting team, and guys have gone on to be really, really successful. And we built our training lab there, which is where I collected data for research, but it also served a dual purpose for the team to train, and I coached the team and wrote the programming for them. This is back 2010, 2011, 2012. And Mike Taylor came to me, came in to one of our meetings and kind of one of our informational things, and came to train. And I remember the first time he was in our training lab at Florida State. He was squatting maybe 275 pounds, 125 kilos. Very skinny, squatting in like these white Keds shoes, but was just the nicest, most respectful person. He was very young in college at that point, maybe freshman, sophomore. And he's now squatting over 600 pounds. And he just put the work in. I gave him his programs. He did them. He had questions where appropriate, but there's no complaining. He put the work in over time, and he's benching. I think he's benched 400. He's squatting 600, deadlifting over 600, and this is a guy that didn't have the best genetics ever for this and so forth, and of course that plays a role, but just put the work in. I can't say enough about what a respectful person this guy is, what a hard worker this guy is, how well he's going to do and everything he does. So anyways, it's not just to talk about Mike so much, but if you put the work in, it will come, and Mike is the exact opposite of what a baby man is. So I just give him a lot of credit. This term actually started. I remember this term started when I was doing daily maximal training, and it's a joking term, and we have fun with it and so forth. Actually, if you want to know what a baby man is, I can post a picture of Ben Esgrove for you, and you'll be able to see what a baby man looks like. This started. I was doing daily maximal training, and when I did daily maximal training for the first time back in 2011, I think it was. I wasn't happy with my performance at a meet. I called up one of the other guys that was at the meet on our team at Florida State. I said, "Hey, would you like to start max squatting every day?" This was the day after, and he was a crazy person, so he said, "Okay." And so we would take bets to who was every single day. We would bet food or whatever to see who was going to squat more that day or relative to our strength. And one day, because I was just way too jacked up, I guess I won the bet for that day, and I just started screaming at him that he was a baby man. And I think he was looking at me like, "Well, you sound like a moron. You just look like an idiot now." And I probably did. But it's a joking term, and that's where that term started. But I think baby man, even though it's a joke. Look at it objectively or seriously for a second, if you will, and just, when you walk into the gym every day, you have a choice to make. Are you going to do your job? And doing your job is just, I'm not. If you have a training program, you're not asked to do anything special. Do what's on your program, get it done, put the work in, focus over time, don't complain, don't get too high, don't get too low. Take care of your life responsibilities before your lifting responsibilities. Keep things in perspective. There's none of this. Jeremy Lineker and I talk. He's the man as well. Just I'm not feeling it today. Okay, but you still got to get the work done. So a baby man is someone who's the opposite of that. Who complains, who worries too much, who doesn't have the mindset, who doesn't know how to deal with adversity. Lets lifting. A baby man is also somebody who lets lifting take over their life. Who doesn't do their job, who gets too worked up into lifting, who who lets lifting ruin their day. A baby man, baby woman, a man or a woman, somebody who's not on the baby side, doesn't let those things happen. They take care of it, and they just do their job. You have a job to do, just get it done. It's not that hard in the long run. So that's what a baby man is or isn't, or a baby woman is or isn't. And Mike is the opposite of that, and he's just a great guy. That's the epitome of everything, of doing things the right way, working hard, and watching that progress come over time.
That's an interesting definition of a proper mindset. So we have a question from Jason Millard. I think you guys are friends on Facebook as well.
Yeah. Jason's a super nice guy, man. We worked together for a little bit, and he's always kind of supported our strategies and our theories, and my interactions with him always just been great guy to talk to when we work together, man. So please, question.
Yeah, so he posted two questions, and I think we already answered his first question. I'll just repeat it. You don't need to answer. He asking how can one implement daily training into series of blocks preparing for a meet once a year. So he will say split in a couple of blocks. The first block would be hypertrophy. Then you can have a volume block, 6 to 8 weeks. Then you switch to a daily max for 30 to 40 days. Then again switch to a volume week, intensity week, both 4 to 6 weeks, and then peaking period. I guess we already, you already answered this when we spoke about the daily max lifting. Or how would you put it in a bigger picture and do it between the I would say usual training, focusing on a volume, focusing on intensity, and then maybe doing a high frequency training or daily max, and then transitioning from that to some other block. So we'll just keep this question. You can come back to it because I think the second one is more interesting, and we haven't covered that. So Jason is asking what suggestion does Mike has for using daily undulating model in linear progression? Instead of prescribing reps, can he prescribe intensities for each power, hypertrophy, strength, and corresponding ratios for hypertrophy block, a volume block, and a strength block? And he's just following up to clarify. For example, in a hypertrophy block, he just mentioned the ratio should be 3 workouts hypertrophy, 1 workout power, and 1 workout strength, around 65, 75, and 82%. Then changing for a volume block where you have 2 to 1 to 1. So 2 hypertrophy workouts, 1 power and 1 strength, using 70, 80, and 85%. And in daily max, you're actually doing daily max. And when it comes to a strength block, you are doing 3 strength workouts, 1 power and 1 hypertrophy at 85 to 95%, 80%, and 75%. So hopefully you get the question. So he's basically asking how would the ratios between hypertrophy, power, and strength workouts vary between the blocks, and corresponding percentages used.
Yeah, the question is fantastic, and I would expect nothing less from Jason. He always had fantastic questions when we were corresponding via email. So first, it's cool to hear this concept. I started talking about the concept of training ratios about 3-4 years ago now, and it's just cool to have all of this come to light. I remember I spoke at Lane Norton's first camp that he had, his VIP camp, back in 2012, and I was talking about undulating periodization and training 3 times a week, and at the time nobody was doing this. And I was speaking to a bunch of bodybuilders, and at first I think they looked at me like a crazy person, but it's just cool to see these concepts really be kind of more accepted, and people do them and so forth, and get much more play, and so many people talking about them and so many people utilizing them, which is a very, very cool thing. Because just a few years ago, saying, hey, we're going to integrate some of these strategies or train 3 times a week on a lift, it wasn't accepted. It really wasn't. And it's just cool to see these things come to play a little bit. But in terms of training ratios, first and foremost, I think this goes into specificity. So let's take a bodybuilder and a powerlifter. Certainly, a powerlifter is most interested in one-arm strength, but hypertrophy is a component of that because strength is going to be somewhat dependent on cross-sectional area of skeletal muscle. a bodybuilder is mostly mostly concerned with hypertrophy, but needs to be concerned with strength, because if they get stronger, they can lift more weights, meaning they can overload. Thus, that's going to bring more volume and more subsequent muscle hypertrophy. So a bodybuilder should, especially in a volume block, probably have a training ratio of more, quote, hypertrophy or higher volume type of days compared to strength type of days. So that would mean more, let's say, a 2 to 1 to 1 ratio of hypertrophy type days versus strength type days. But to be honest, I don't necessarily think about things in those terms as much anymore. I think about things more in terms of blocks of volume and intensity. So if we think about a linear macro cycle, let's say that lasts a year, I would see that the preparatory phase for a bodybuilder, where they're doing volume blocks, would last longer than it would for a powerlifter, whereas they would transition sooner from the preparatory phase to the peaking phase to the intensity. So you can certainly utilize things if you're using a daily undulating periodization model, where you have, let's say, within a week, 2 or 3 quintessential hypertrophy days and then 1 or 2 strength and power days for a bodybuilder. But what I would just do is throughout the course of the linear cycle, you would have blocks that have a theme. Volume blocks have a theme of undulating the reps, but the theme is a lower RPE. So more repetitions in reserve. And that preparatory phase just simply lasts longer for a bodybuilder because it's predicated more on higher reps and volume, whereas a powerlifter has a little bit of a shorter preparatory phase before they go into the peaking phase, where it's predicated then on more intensity and lower repetitions for them. The other thing, but the training ratios you can certainly use in that realm, but in terms of a linear progression within between weeks, we talked about that a little bit earlier as well, whereas if you have, let's say, a undulation pattern of 6-4-2 within a week, on the Tuesday, you're gradually increasing the intensities, or you're going from doubles, let's say week 1 at a 9 RP, to doubles at a 9.5 RP, to doubles at a 10 RP in the last week. Now you have increased the intensity gradually from week to week. Then to Jason's question about intensity zones, this is a little bit dicey because it's somewhat lifter dependent. I'll explain. But if you have, let's say, somebody who's looking to do hypertrophy work, or hypertrophy type work, I should say that I don't believe there's an optimal, quote, rep range for hypertrophy. As we typically thought, 8 to 12 reps. I think the data is pretty clear that 10 reps are not inherently superior to, let's say, 2 reps for hypertrophy. However, from a efficiency time perspective, we did a study here looking at 2 different daily undulating periodization models. My student Alex Klemp did a fantastic job on his thesis looking at muscle growth and strength, and we saw no difference in muscle growth in an undulation pattern that was relatively equated for volume between 12-10-8 and 6-4-2 throughout the course of 8 weeks. But we did see the higher repetition group, it took them half the time to complete the session as opposed to the lower repetition group. So I don't think there's inherently something that's better for hypertrophy in terms of rep range, but I think from a practical perspective it doesn't matter because the higher repetitions are going to be better in that sense because they're more efficient to complete. A range, let's say, for 10 repetitions for somebody to maintain an 8 RPE, 65-70% is probably a good way to gauge that. However, if somebody is much better at muscular endurance than another, then the person that's much better at muscular endurance might be able to maintain 10s at an 8 RPE at 75%. So that's why we have to also utilize RPE to be able to adjust for the individual. If you want to stress them at an 8 RPE for hypertrophy days at 70%, but you get their numbers and they're recording 5 RPEs, then that person might need to be adjusted, where somebody else might only be able to maintain that zone at 65% and so forth. And it would be the same across each repetition range.
Okay, thanks for sharing on that one. Quite interesting answer, and also quite interesting question. Not sure how much is it applied to team settings because of high frequency, in this case 4 to 5 sessions a week, but it's quite interesting when it comes to powerlifting and bodybuilding applications.
Sure.
Yeah, next question comes from Johnny Candito. He's a powerlifter. Are you probably familiar with him? I follow him on Twitter and Facebook and YouTube. I think you already touched a bit about on the problems he mentioned in his question, but I'll just read it and you can expand a little bit. So Johnny is asking, how does Mike approach deadlift training, given it seems he favors high volume / frequency on squats, but traditionally that doesn't work as well for most people on pulls, or maybe it does. I'd be curious if he mixes philosophies, say high volume squats like an Olympic lifter, more West Side inspired pull protocol concurrently, specialize on either squat on deadlift given a particular training cycle to avoid conflict, or simply pulls with lower volume but almost always same basic setup as squats in terms of emphasis on specificity with modest exercise variation, similar loading, rep ranges, and so forth.
First, I'm certainly familiar with Johnny. He probably doesn't know this because I don't really comment on the internet, but I admire his lifting and watching him in meets. Very, very strong guy, very young guy, so certainly a fan of his. So a tip of the cap to him for what he's accomplished with his lifting over the past few years. Somebody I enjoy watching lifting and as a fan of the sport. To his question in terms of programming squats and deadlifts and so forth, yes, I would say for the most part, if somebody's seen programs that I've written and I don't really make anything public, so somebody that I've worked with or somebody's gotten a hold of something, typically for the most part, I'm squatting, bringing the squat out front and deadlifting afterwards, which obviously on a day-to-day basis will have somebody fatigued for the deadlift and so forth. But I will say that our recent paper that we came out with shows similar progress with a lower frequency on the deadlift as opposed to the squat. I think this is probably for two reasons. One, the deadlift may not need to be trained as frequently, although that doesn't mean it's the case for everybody. But also the squat is likely going to build the deadlift rather than the other way around, more so, rather than the deadlift building the squat. So we're going to bring the squat out front. However, different blocks can and should probably focus on different things. So even though for the most part I'm going to bring the squat out front, there are times throughout the year where I might have 4 blocks that have the squat out front, but then there's another block where we're going to look at an overreaching cycle on the deadlift while we're maintaining the squat to go ahead and peak the deadlift and bring that closer to where it needs to be before we go back to more of a traditional setup. But this also goes back, as we talked about previously, to the concept between incorporating those later power days in. This is the time where if somebody really needs to bring the deadlift out front and we do that, we can go ahead and put that power squat day in there. That's much later, and it give us a little bit more frequency or more leeway to deadlift. Of course, you can also just bring the squat frequency down to twice a week and have a more deadlift-centric day, if you will. But the other thing that you can do too is, again, we get confined to thinking about things in terms of 1 week, a 7-day cycle. Well, you can have, let's say, training every other day on either the squat or the deadlift, and let's say you're going through whatever your undulation pattern is, and Monday you squat more moderate reps, Wednesday you deadlift more moderate reps, and then Friday lower rep squat, Sunday lower reps deadlift, and then you go back to the moderate rep squat. So now you're getting a frequency of about 2.5 times a week on each, but you're not sacrificing either one. So there's kind of an infinite amount of ways to set this up that it can still focus on the concept. I believe that for most people, the squat would probably need to be trained with a higher frequency, and our data seems to support that, than the deadlift would need to be, and the deadlift can be trained with a lower volume and utilizing a lot of singles and lower repetitions on the deadlift, because that gives you more chances to walk up and practice your setup on the deadlift. And of course, the deadlift begins with the concentric portion, not the eccentric portion, hence the lower repetitions there. So there's really so many strategies that go into that, whether it's different blocks focusing on different things and bringing out the deadlift in a certain phase, whether it's incorporating the power squat day. So if I'm at a more traditional setup where I'm squatting, let's say 3 times a week with an undulation pattern, whatever it is, maybe 8-6-4 on a Monday, Wednesday, Friday, that time I'll still use kind of an undulating strategy on the deadlifts, but not necessarily for reps. If I'm just deadlifting Monday, Friday, 2 days a week, more so the intensity and the volume, where I might have one day a lighter deadlift with singles around 80%, but a higher number of sets, and then I'll undulate in terms of get a higher intensity, maybe 90% on that Friday, but have a lower number of sets to correspond with the higher intensity that day. So there's so many ways to set that up if you want to have a deadlift-focused cycle, or to bring out the power squat day, which will allow you to be a little more deadlift-centric and focused on that day. But our data does seem to suggest that the squat would build the deadlift more than the other way around, and the deadlift can get away with a little bit of a lower frequency than the squat can. But that doesn't mean that you can't have cycles where you bring the deadlift out front and use an undulating pattern on that as you move forward throughout your yearly macro cycle and where you want to slot that.
That's great. Thanks for answering. That's an interesting question by Johnny, and thanks to Johnny for asking. This is the last question from Ty Carzoli he's asking how was your dissertation? How did your dissertation went?
So apparently, I thought joke time was over, but apparently joke time has started again. So actually, I'd like to amend my point earlier where I was talking about the picture of Esgro for baby man status. If we could just like morph Ty and Ben's faces together, that would be the ultimate baby man right there. So pretty much if you want to be not be a baby man, just do whatever the opposite of whatever Ty does. Ty is somebody who's become a good friend of mine. Hence, joking around here. Ty was a subject in my dissertation. He's a great guy. He's actually finishing up his degree in Doctor of Chiropractic at Life University. He's assisted on some of our research here since I've been at Florida Atlantic. A good lifter in his own right, very technical. So for the long short story short, I make jokes that Ty almost single-handedly caused me to not graduate. He asked a question at my dissertation defense, which was pretty much an inside joke. It made absolutely no sense whatsoever. And my committee members turned around and looked at him like, what is he asking? But of course, I was trying to graduate that day. So instead of laughing, I had to look at him. And I looked at him with a real serious face and said, hey, I'm not really sure what you're getting at, but if we could keep the questions on topic, I'd really appreciate it. That was pretty inappropriate. So if anybody has any real questions, I would like to move on. And at the time, I had to give him that pretty serious answer. And I felt bad about it, but I had to make sure I could graduate that day, so my committee members didn't get mad at me. But it was a great question. We always joke about it absolutely makes no sense whatsoever. But when we lift, I usually say, hey, we're going to go defend the Constitution, or promote freedom today. It makes absolutely no sense. Don't read too much into it. But he said something like that related to the personal liberty I was feeling from the squatting I was doing, and it's a nonsensical phrase, but he said it in my dissertation defense. It was hilarious, but I couldn't entertain it, so I could graduate. But it was great. I had about 75 to 100 people in the room that day, which was pretty crazy. But Ty's a great guy, doing some good work in his own right over there. So I appreciate him checking in. But the biggest thing you should know about Ty is that his little brother is stronger than him. So I'm not sure how he goes through life knowing that his little brother has out-totaled him in a meet. That just sounds terrible. If I were him, I would probably quit all athletic events for the rest of my life.
I like to finish with a proper banter as you did. You have some funny friends there.
Yeah, they're good guys, man. It's what makes all of this worthwhile. We go to the people that you're going to meet throughout the years, kind of in the athletics realm and sports realm and so forth. So just very fortunate to meet so many good people and to get to know so many good people, man. So, man, if there's one thing that's just awesome, whether it's about powerlifting or this kind of community in general, is just getting to meet people and why you wouldn't want to get to meet more people and get to know more people and collaborate with more people is beyond me. So fantastic guys there, fantastic people asking questions, and hopefully get to interact with more of them in the future.
That's awesome. And with Ty's question, we finish with the readers' questions, and I'll just quickly wanna touch a couple more questions, which just some miscellaneous things, if I pronounced it correctly. What are the good resources you can recommend
for training information?
Yeah, training information and periodization and stuff like that.
I get this question a lot about textbooks, and I personally, I know when I teach my classes, I don't use textbooks because typically by the time a textbook is written, it's outdated. However, if you're not in the field of exercise physiology and you're just looking to get some background baseline knowledge, there's certainly some textbooks out there. I mean, the Essentials of Strength Training and Conditioning always comes to mind. It's not groundbreaking. It's not going to touch on a lot of the intricate concepts of periodization that we just did, but it will give you the basics of skeletal muscle physiology and adaptation and those types of responses to training that you can always go ahead and look for If you have access to scientific papers, that's fantastic. However, sometimes if people aren't experienced in reading scientific papers, they can misinterpret it. More in the practical realm out there. Just a lot of people I mentioned are people that I'd recommend following, and the more people you can follow, the more you can kind of decipher, what is good information, what's not, and how you can integrate these things together. One of the guys I think gives some of the most just baseline correct information is Matt Gary. A guy that has a sound understanding of periodization, a sound understanding of specificity, and has been one of the most accomplished coaches in powerlifting for many, many years. And in my opinion, is the best guy in the world to learn technique from would be Matt. So I would do that. What I'm about to do, I guess I'm going to mention it, but I've tried to avoid this just because I don't want anybody to think I'm trying to sell anything. It's not what I'm here to do, but I did record something recently with Eric Helms called Shredded by Science Academy, which Luke Johnson and Lawrence Judd are putting out, and it's got fantastic information. I really feel good about the information that we put out there. If somebody's interested in that, if you're not interested in that, don't. That's fine. I don't care. Reactive Training Systems Classroom that I did with Mike Zourdos, if you're interested in that, that's out there as well. But if you're not and you don't want to spend the money, I don't care. It's not going to affect my life. So I don't want to think anybody think I'm going out of my way to promote those things. I'm certainly not. The other people I've mentioned as well earlier today are great resources to look for. But for a baseline textbook, Essentials of Strength Training and Conditioning is great. Pick that up. If you can get, honestly, I think it would be beneficial for somebody to just get kind of a basic anatomy and physiology textbook to understand muscle, to understand the skeletal system, to understand adaptation, to understand different mechanisms that regulate homeostasis in the body. That's probably more important than any of the other stuff. I always talk to my classes, if we don't understand basic skeletal muscle adaptations first, and we don't understand basic endocrine adaptations, and we don't understand compensatory mechanisms that the body has, it makes no sense to start talking about periodization and certain sets and reps and so forth. And I think actually that's a great thing to talk about too if you're trying to look for somebody to ask for advice on training. Anybody can regurgitate information, but their ability to answer questions is when you can really tell if they know what they're talking about. One of the reasons I said, hey, I want to stay out of the nutrition aspect of it earlier is I have some knowledge. I've published scientific papers in that area, but I would be exposed very quickly answering questions on that as opposed to an Eric Helms or Elaine Norton or Ben Esgro or somebody like that. That's really their area. So I'm not going to do that because there's people that know it better than I do. So I think if you are looking for information as well and you are looking for individuals, don't just look for somebody that can regurgitate something. Look for somebody that can answer questions. And if somebody can answer questions about it, that's a good sign. And nobody can be the expert on everything. I know what I know, but it's also very limited within the field of exercise physiology. So anyways, a basic textbook on anatomy or physiology or biochemistry might be a good source, even rather than a training textbook, just to understand basic adaptations, how and why they occur.
Yeah, that makes sense. What's your future work? What do you plan doing? Studies, papers, and projects?
I got a study that's lined up right now. It's 8 weeks of comparing Ty Carzoli baby man training to Ben Esgro baby man training, and to see if the person just crumbles into some sort of super mega baby man. I think that they will. We're always trying to advance things, and research is always an ongoing process. It's there's so many things out there. We like to there's been actually. Like I said, we did a recent study looking at relatively equated volume across different repetition ranges, but also in a periodized model. And it's been done before, but we're the first to do it in a periodized model, daily undulating periodized model. So we're looking to get that paper out. One of my students did. We've done a lot of stuff recently looking at various growth factors. One of my students did a study in responsive resistance training, looking at the neuroprotective effect, BDNF, brain-derived neurotropic growth factor. So we're looking at that response to training. We have a study going on now that's a concurrent training study looking at various types of the same resistance training program, but also with a different modes of cardio, whether it's steady state cardio, high intensity cardio, or using a barbell circuit as cardio, which is the novel aspect, to look at changes in strength, hypertrophy, and fat loss. Again, I think that also goes to adherence to what you enjoy. To the question I mentioned earlier from Esgro, which is, are you doing something because you want to or because you think you have to? I think those cardio models, I think our data is showing it kind of comes down to what you enjoy and what you can maintain. Expounding more upon periodization, going more into the RP, RIR scale in terms of, how can you make sure that somebody's RP or RIR is efficacious? How can you make sure it's correct? How can you validate it? We know the scale is a good idea, but if somebody records a 6 RPE, that doesn't mean that they're correct with it. So how can people train to utilize that more? We have all those things going on, the Daily 1RM protocol, some data that we've collected specifically at powerlifting meets, which I think we're working on now with the Tendo unit on the bar at meets, looking at attempt selection data and so forth. I think it's going to be interesting. And then the BDNF stuff and some of the exercise biochemistry. One of my colleagues at our university leads our exercise biochemistry lab, and has taught me some skills there, man. So it really never ends. And I just want to reiterate one point from earlier is, when you do a research study, oftentimes you're comparing one group to another group, and it's not the end-all be-all, but it's showing a concept. So we're always trying to expound upon the concept, understanding that finding the optimal protocol doesn't exist, it will never exist, and you can't. But we're trying to continue to develop the concepts as much as we can, and overall, do good work. And I'm just really fortunate to have amazing students, amazing colleagues, and good support here to be able to conduct these things, man. So it's pretty fun time here for what we're doing.
Where can interested readers can reach you, and where they can find more about you and your work? Because you don't have a blog, you don't post much. It's like you don't exist if you don't have blog anymore. So just kidding. The thing is, like, people are blogging, having websites, and that's definitely not a sign of a good coach or a good researcher. And I'm just using my example as well. So I might be a much better writer than I'm a coach. Might be a much better theorist than I'm actually a practitioner. But anyway, where can people find more about you?
Well, I will say that I like to not exist to an extent. I bought a website domain name about 3 years ago, and I've never done anything with it, and I have no plans to do anything with it, just because I like to not exist. I want to be known first and foremost for doing research and taking care of my responsibilities at a university, rather than being in the practical. Not in the practical realm. I enjoy being in the practical realm, but being known for coaching lifters and this and that. And I have about 20 to 30 clients at any given time, but I don't advertise for that. If people contact me, I'll work with them. If they don't contact me, then that's fine. So to find out more about us, I don't know. Go on PubMed and search us every month and see if we've come out with something new. I'm not one. I'm sure I'll post this interview up when it comes out. I'll post our papers up when they come out. But I don't go out there and aggressively do things, because it's just not my style. If people want to find out, they will. I do talk at a number of things throughout the year, but it's selective, just because I try to make sure I'm taking care of family life first and so forth, and I just don't need the aggravation of being out on the internet all the time. And there's a lot to be said for a lot of benefits of it, but it's just not my style. So I don't have anything that somebody can read on a daily basis, and I don't intend to have anything anytime soon. It doesn't mean I never will, but I need to take care of my students first and foremost, that I've committed to, and my colleagues, and that's most important for the time being. So I guess, like I said, there is Shredded by Science Academy, and there is Mike Zourdos' Reactive Training System Classroom, and some stuff that I did with him that will be coming out, I guess, if you want to look into that. But other than that, I'll post our papers every now and then. And if you contact me, you can look me up. You can contact me by email if you do want to work together. Great. If you don't, then no problem. No big deal for me. If you have questions that way, it'll take me a long time to respond, just because I got to take care of my students first. But I'll try to get back to you. But it's just being out there on the internet. Posting things and blogging things isn't necessarily my style, but hey, it doesn't mean I won't be there one day. But search our group into PubMed every month, and we'll probably have a new paper coming out. That'd probably be the best way to do it.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Thanks a lot, Mike, for the time, for everything, for sharing such a lot of information, a lot of useful information, and this is a pretty long interview or podcast. So,
I got 3 hours and 32 minutes on my audio recording right here, but I've enjoyed it, my friend. I appreciate it very much, and I had been looking forward to this for a while because I anticipated a great conversation, and it exceeded my expectations. So I hope everybody's listening. It's beneficial for them, and I hope it's beneficial for your listeners and all that stuff, man.
we should come up with the written version of this and sell it as a book.
If we'll discuss, That's another thing people ask me. Where's your ebook? It doesn't exist. It's not going to exist. I don't know. I don't know what else to tell you. If you're waiting for that, I have bad news. I think I'll end up writing something someday or a book someday, but not now. Research is ever changing. Things are constantly progressing too, and if I do put something out, I want to feel good about it, and I don't want to put it out to make money. I want to put it out because it's good information, and I don't think we're at the point where we have enough information where I'm ready to put all those things out there. So that's why it doesn't exist.
Yeah, I have one idea, and I don't want to go much details about it. I have a book idea, and you're probably gonna like the idea because most of the coaches and writers struggle with putting some of their ideas in a concise form, in an organized form. So actually answering questions, like Charlie Francis did with his book, he actually answered questions, and that's a book. Or actually, solving the case studies might be a way to actually, get some applied information from coaches that don't actually like to write, and they don't like to kind of create a written model because their thoughts are so unorganized, if that makes sense. So just asking them questions and trying to solve the case studies might be a way forward.
Yeah, I think that definitely has efficacy. I think that not to say, hey, I think I could do this or that. I actually think I could write a really, really effective book. Kind of what I do for a living is scientific writing, and I think I have a pretty decent way of putting that out in a practical manner if I so chose to. It's just for me right now, it's the time. I'm more concerned with answering more questions in the literature, taking care of my students, working toward tenure at university and all that kind of stuff and those career goals before I would want to sit down and worry about, hey, putting this information out there and making money and doing all those sorts of things. And I think it'll come for me at some point, but it's not yet. And I think we have so many questions to answer that if I put something out, I think it would I would want to change it in a year. I would want to say, man, I'd like to make a lot of amendments to this right now. And so I think you always have to look at opportunity cost. If I spend time doing that right now in my life, that's less time that I'm going to spend taking care of my students and spend taking care of doing new research, which ultimately would make a better book in the long run. So when I ultimately put something out there, it's because this is the information that we spent a long time building and working toward and so forth. So it's just the time. It's the time aspect, and it's doing things at the right time and so forth. But I think your model of asking people questions and people putting things out in case studies, I think that would be very, very, very cool and very beneficial as well. So who knows what the future holds, man?
Yeah, exactly. Thanks a lot, Mike, and let's catch up soon again.
Thank you, and thank everybody for listening if you make it this entire time.